Judici Matters to allow a full reference to the Northern Ireland Protocol. We now come to questions to the Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Development Affairs. We now call Alan Brown.
Question 1, Mr. Speaker.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I will answer questions 1, 3 and 13 together. My right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, met the Israeli President Mr. Herzog and the Israeli Foreign Minister Lapid during their respective visits to the UK in November. I also recently discussed the situation in Israel and the OPTs with Israeli Deputy Foreign Minister Roll and Palestinian Prime Minister Steyer. The Foreign Secretary made clear her commitments to the Abraham Accords at the Gulf Cooperation Council UK Kingdom Foreign Ministers meeting on the 20th of December. The UK is working with Gulf partners to help deliver shared prosperity and security for Arabs and Israelis alike. We support the objectives of the US Middle East Partnership for Peace Act, and we will continue to engage with the US to identify opportunities for further collaboration. I outlined the UK's support for increasing dialogue between Israelis and Palestinians at all MEPs like the Way Gala on the 12th of December.
Alan Brown.
Mr. Speaker. Meanwhile, evictions and demolitions continue in East Jerusalem aimed at eradicating Palestinian presence from the Holy Basin, a cemetery desecrated to make way for a Jewish national park, a new settlements plan designed to smash the concept of a two-state solution. So when will the UK Government actually take actions to demonstrate that violations of international law do indeed have consequences?
Mr. Speaker, the UK enjoys a close and important relationship with Israel, and that enables us to raise important issues such as settlement demolitions directly with the Israeli government, which we do. The UK's long-standing policy is to pursue actions which support the creation of a viable two-state solution. That will remain the focus of our actions, both in our engagement with the Government of Israel and the Palestinian Authority.
Stephen Crabb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If anybody wants to see something genuinely positive and uplifting when it comes to foreign affairs, they should look at the Abraham Accords and the fruit that's stemming from it in terms of the remarkable growth in trade, investment, people-to-people contact between Israel, the UAE and other Arab states. So, given the UK's excellent relations throughout the Gulf region and also its bilateral ties with Israel, does my right honourable friend agree that we are well placed as the United Kingdom to help foster the growth of this Abraham Accords fruit? And will he look at how he can encourage other states to embark on the same journey of peace and friendship with Israel?
My right honourable friend is absolutely right that the UK enjoys excellent relations with all the signatory nations of the Abraham Accords. I indeed was in Bahrain when the first ever Bahraini ambassador to the State of Israel was announced, and it was genuinely a joyous occasion. The UK will continue to support the Abraham Accords, will continue to support greater joint working between the states in the region. Ultimately, that is the best way to pursue peace, to pursue prosperity and to pursue freedom for all.
Holly Lynch.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In 2017, I had the opportunity to visit Israel and Palestine, and what I saw in the West Bank really did shock me. We cannot ever see a return to last year's violence, and so I asked the Minister to renew our commitment to a international fund for Israeli-Palestinian peace based on the International Fund for Ireland model, and update the House on our international efforts to make the fund and lasting peace a reality.
The Honourable Lady makes a very important point about the relationships between Israelis and Palestinians. The UK has, does and will continue to support and facilitate people-to-people contacts, cross-community contacts, as well as making sure that the Government of Israel and the Palestinian Authority also have a good working relationship. This will be and will remain a foundation stone of our foreign policy in the region. With regard to ALMEP, we have had discussions with the United States of America, and I've had discussions with representatives of the organisation, and will continue to explore what role the UK might play in the future delivery of that.
Dr. Matthew Offord.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The successful conclusion of peace talks between Israel and the Palestinians is key to bringing peace to the region. Yet Hamas publicly condemns peace negotiations and has committed itself to Israel's destruction. Does my right honourable friend agree that until Hamas disarms, Israel cannot be expected to negotiate with a terror group that calls for its very destruction?
Mr. Speaker, Hamas have not proven themselves to be good for the Palestinian people. The simple truth is that their aggressive posture, their threats to eradicate the State of Israel, has harmed relations between Israelis and Palestinians. We wish to see a viable two-state solution with Israelis and Palestinians living side by side in peace and in prosperity and in freedom. Hamas has long been a roadblock to that, and we call upon them to set aside their violent ways and to pursue a path of peace.
Question 2, please, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, with permission, I will answer questions 2, 6 and 11 together. The UK has supported over 3,400 people to leave Afghanistan since the end of op-pitting evacuation, and we will continue in our efforts. The UK is contributing £286 million in humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan this financial year, and we have disbursed over £145 million already so far. My noble friend Lord Ahmed in the other place visited Qatar on the 17th of January to discuss these issues directly with the Qatari government.
Dr. Impert.
What was a monumental military miscalculation has turned into a humanitarian catastrophe, with Gordon Brown, bless his cotton socks, warning of 23 million women, children, people facing starvation. That's 97% of the population below the poverty line. What are they doing to ensure that aid bypasses the Taliban and reaches those in need, which includes all of our constituents, British nationals, who are still trapped in this nightmare, harbouring hopes of getting home?
Mr. Speaker, as I said in response to her initial question, the UK has committed £286 million and already distributed £145 million. We do recognise that there is a pragmatic need to have a relationship of some sort with the Taliban. However, our conditions for this have always been clear: that they need to renounce violence, not be a haven for terrorism, and not take part in reprisal actions. Aid diversion is always an important consideration, and that is as true in Afghanistan as it is anywhere else. We are seeking to support the Afghan people, not prop up a Taliban regime.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday I heard the shocking story of a refugee struck in Iran, unable to leave because he has been told he needs to register with the Iranian government. There have been cases of refugees in Iran being returned to their countries of origin. So he is too scared to register. Will the Minister act to ensure that cases like that don't occur, to secure a safe route and meet me to discuss this specific case?
Mr. Speaker, I invite the honourable gentleman to write to me about this case. My noble friend, the Lord Ahmed, speaks with countries in the region that border Afghanistan. The House will be unsurprised to hear that our relationship with Iran is more strained than the relationship we have with other countries in the region. Nevertheless, we recognise that land routes across to Iran are an exit route for some people who are in fear of their lives in Afghanistan. It's not possible for me to comment on individual cases without more details.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Afghan citizens at risk cannot move since without safe destinations in third countries to escape to, many of the risks experienced in Kabul will not be safeguarded against the specific measures in place. With the ACRS inoperable, government promises to protect minoritised groups, human rights activists and campaigners in tatters. What discussions is he having with the leadership in third countries to guarantee a safe destination? And how is the UK contributing to the safety of these people at this time?
Mr. Speaker, I refer the Honourable Lady to the answers I've already given on this issue. We have supported over 3,400 people to leave Afghanistan since the end of the op-pitting evacuation in August. This includes over 2,200 Afghan citizens who either work for the UK or in support of UK objectives or are vulnerable. Female judges, LGBT activists, injured children, for example. The UK is absolutely playing its part, and we will continue to liaise with other countries both in the region and those that border Afghanistan to help alleviate the terrible situation that Afghans find themselves in.
Well, Logan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And the APPG in Afghanistan would like to invite the Minister's Department to give an update on what representations the Department has made to international counterparts in line with what the Honourable Member for York Central said against the force used by the Taliban against those protesting deteriorating living standards.
Mr. Speaker, I will pass on the comments he's made to my noble friend, the Lord Ahmed, and I know he takes the issues that have just been raised incredibly seriously. Lord Ahmed visited New York in October to hold events with Afghan women and speak at the UN's annual debate for women, peace and security, and my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, has visited a number of countries in the region and beyond to solicit their support in alleviating the situation in Afghanistan.
The
Open Doors World Watch List identified Afghanistan as the most dangerous place in the world to be a Christian. Will the government put protection and support of Christians around the world and in Afghanistan at the heart of their foreign policy?
Mr. Speaker, the freedom of religion and belief remains an incredibly important strand in UK foreign policy. The plight of Christians in Afghanistan is dire, but indeed that is reflective of the plight of a number of other religious and ethnic minorities in Afghanistan. It is a cornerstone of our foreign policy, of our pursuit for genuine freedom for all, and freedom of religion or belief is important to that, because without that, is anyone really free at all?
Steve Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are many people in Wickham who have connections to people stuck in Afghanistan who they believe would have had a pre-existing visa entitlement to come to the UK. What steps will the government take to make sure that those people who would have been entitled, had the government not fallen in Afghanistan, to make sure those people can, in fact, come and join their families in Wickham?
Mr. Speaker, the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office and the Home Office have maintained a good and close working relationship on issues such as this throughout this. Obviously, entitlement for foreign nationals to have a settlement here in the UK is ultimately a Foreign Office competency, Home Office competency, I do apologise, Home Office competency, but we will continue to work closely with the Home Office on issues such as these.
Minister, please.
Mr. Speaker, the situation facing millions of Afghans right now is unimaginable. Starving families lining up for food, parents selling their babies and handing teenage daughters to the Taliban for cash, a mother so desperate she sold her kidney and 2 of her daughters. Yet amid this horror, the UK government slashed the overseas aid budget, actually cut its support for Afghanistan from 2019 levels, and with only 2 months to go, dispersed only half of the humanitarian aid and assistance it promised. With 5 million children now on the brink of famine, will the government show leadership and release the remainder of the pledge and take the action proposed by the UN, Save the Children and former Prime Minister Gordon Brown to convene a humanitarian pledging conference to raise the 5 billion needed? A failure to act will cost more lives.
Mr. Speaker, the 286 million that we have allocated to Afghanistan, I would remind her, was actually put in place in the autumn, and we are still ensuring that money is distributed. And the Honourable Lady made the important point that doing so quickly can sometimes come at the cost of doing so carefully. We want to ensure that our money reaches the people who are in need and is not diverted to support the Taliban regime. The UK has and remains at the forefront of international efforts to support Afghanistan. I'm proud of the work that my department, other departments and the UK government as a whole has done.
Question 4, please, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, with permission, I'll answer questions 4 and 10 together. Democracy and freedom are at the heart of our Foreign Secretary's vision for a network of liberty, which will use partnerships in trade, security and technology to promote democratic values. And we are committed to working with partners and allies across the world, including civil society, to support more open, inclusive and accountable societies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine became a free and independent country by the choice of its people, and quite rightly that was supported by the United Kingdom. But in this time of threat from the Russians, can my right honourable friend confirm that she will do all she can to ensure that Ukraine stays free, whether by diplomatic, economic or military means?
Mr. Speaker, the UK and our allies are unwavering in our support for Ukraine's sovereignty and for Ukraine's territorial integrity. Any Russian military incursion into Ukraine would be a massive strategic mistake and would come at severe cost to Russia. We're working with our partners on developing a package of broad and high-impact sanctions targeting the Russian financial sector and individuals. And we are also providing a range of support to enhance Ukraine's defensive capability.
Richard Graham.
Mr. Speaker, I saw in Sarajevo last week how well appreciated is the government's robust response to the secession threats from the Republika Srpska in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and also how appreciated is the Westminster Foundation for Democracy's 5-year programme, working very closely with missions there on more inclusive community and political leadership. But this programme comes to an end at the end of March, and without certainty of further funding, can I therefore ask my honourable friend to do all she can to expedite budget decisions so that we can continue this valuable programme across the region?
Mr. Speaker, can I start by thanking the honourable member for his work as the chair of the Westminster Foundation for Democracy and all the good that that organisation does globally, including in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We are very proud supporters of the Foundation and especially of the work it does to increase women and young people's participation in politics. Regarding funding decisions, the Foreign Secretary has been clear that we intend to restore funding to women and girls and to humanitarian programmes, and we will be finalising budget allocations shortly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When it comes to democracy and supporting civil society, one of the best things that this government has done was the establishment of the Jo Cox Memorial Grants, funding precisely the sort of women's empowerment organisations that strengthen civil society and with whom Jo worked throughout her life. So through the Minister, may I ask if the Foreign Secretary would consider meeting myself and colleagues from all parties who supported the creation of those grants and who would like to discuss the future of them with the Foreign Secretary?
Mr. Speaker, we have made it clear that we have a clear role to promote freedom and democracy. That is a core mission of the SCDO. I didn't know Jo Cox. I arrived in this house, sadly, after she had left us. But her legacy lives on, and I'm sure the Foreign Secretary would be very happy to meet those who work to keep that legacy going.
David.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is common agreement across this House that Britain's soft power is of inestimable value. So why is the government placing the British Council in the situation where it may be forced to close 20 of its offices?
Mr. Speaker, as I said in my earlier answer, we are looking at budget allocations for the years ahead now that we have a 3-year settlement review from the Treasury and budget decisions have not yet been made.
Minister Catherine Bass.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Time and time again, the Labour Party has raised the issue of the failure to act on the Russia report in this House. The government have been painfully slow at bringing forward the action that we need to implement the report's recommendations. With mounting threats of Russian hostility, can the Minister tell the House what discussions she's had with colleagues across government on the proposed implementation of the Counter-State Threats Bill, the new and refreshed Computer Misuse Act, the reform of Companies House and the Register of Property Ownership, so that London does no longer have to have the reputation of being the laundromat
for the dirty money which comes out of those regimes.
Dirty money.
Mr. Speaker, discussions across government are still continuing.
We now go to SNP spokesperson Alan Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and happy Burns Night to you and to colleagues later on. A word some poor the gift to gie is to see ourselves as others see us would be a useful thing for the Treasury benches to remember at the moment. But the best contribution that we, however we define ourselves, is to help other countries in resilience against disinformation. And I would praise to the rafters the Resist toolkit run out of the Cabinet Office. We already have a set of measures which we can use to assist other countries to combat disinformation. Could the ministers assure us that this will be beefed up, this will be better financed, and this will be rolled out internationally? Because it is a very good domestic toolkit, but we could do a lot more to it because plenty other places really need it.
Mr. Speaker, the integrated review made it very clear that the UK will be a responsible and democratic cyber power, and we intend to use our global network to strengthen the case for open, peaceful and secure digital space, pushing back against those who misuse technology or spread disinformation to undermine democracy.
Graham Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wonder if the Minister could reassure the House that there are no other members who've received hundreds of thousands of pounds of funding without question from hostile actors, and what confidence, therefore, the public can have in this Parliament.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that all members of the House have been watching these stories very closely. Let me just say that the UK does want to have a mature, positive relationship with China based on mutual respect. But we will not sacrifice our values or our security.
Hilary Benn.
Question number 5, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the fact is that the Northern Ireland Protocol is not working. We need to make sure that the dispute resolution mechanism under the Protocol is in line with that in the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement and end the role of the ECJ as the final arbiter.
Hilary Benn.
I'm grateful to the Foreign Secretary for that reply, but as you will know, Article 5 of the Protocol requires Northern Ireland to maintain regulatory alignment with EU rules governing manufactured and agricultural goods. There's about 287 in all set out in Annex 2. Does the government agree that that regulatory alignment should continue? And if so, what type of dispute resolution mechanism does the Foreign Secretary think would be appropriate to determine whether those rules are in fact being applied?
Well, our view is that the type of arbitration mechanism we need is the type in any standard trade agreement, which is an independent arbitration mechanism.
Dr. Philippa Whitford.
Mr. Speaker, recent ONS data shows the Northern Ireland economy recovering more quickly from the pandemic than any other part of the UK, and a survey by Queen's University has shown that while people remain concerned about the impact of Brexit, the majority feels the protocol is providing a unique trading position compared with Great Britain. While there are clearly some specific issues to be resolved, does the Foreign Secretary not recognise that demands to exclude the ECJ are confrontational, and suggestions that Article 16 removes the protocol in its entirety are misleading and creating unrealistic expectations within Northern Ireland?
Mr. Speaker, I'm taking a constructive approach to these negotiations. I was in Brussels yesterday meeting Maros Sefcovic. I do believe there is a deal to be done that helps protect peace and political stability in Northern Ireland, that enables the free flow of goods between GB and Northern Ireland, and our officials are negotiating all this week. I'll be seeing Maros Sefcovic again next week to make positive progress.
We go to Philip Oliver.
Foreign Secretary's constructive approach to the negotiations, but 2 years on from Brexit, can she confirm that disputes cannot go unresolved forever and this situation has to be brought to an end sooner rather than later?
Well, I completely agree with my honourable friend on the urgency of this situation, which is why we have been holding intensive talks with the EU to resolve the very real issues there are for traders in GB and Northern Ireland. And we do need to make sure that we maintain the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the United Kingdom, and we fix this issue once and for all.
Gregory Campbell.
Mr. Speaker, is the Secretary of State aware that confidence in Northern Ireland that the government are going to take decisive action on this and to do it quickly has evaporated, and we need to see that action taken immediately?
Well, I can assure the honourable gentleman that I am working very hard with my EU counterparts to resolve the very difficult situation in Northern Ireland, and it is needed that we sort this out as soon as possible. That's why we're in intensive negotiations. I do believe there is a deal to be done, and I think that's in the interest of the people of Northern Ireland, the people of Great Britain, and also the people of the EU.
Dr. Neil Hudson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have learned that viruses and many infectious agents do not stick to international or indeed domestic borders. This is all too true in the human setting, but also the veterinary setting. With that in mind, what discussions has my right honourable friend had with the EU about the possibility of a veterinary or sanitary and phytosanitary agreement with the EU?
Well, my honourable friend makes a very good point about biosecurity, and of course that's a key priority for us, and it's a key priority for the European Union, and we are exploring all options that maintain the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the UK. And I completely recognise what the honourable gentleman says. These issues cross borders, so of course we need to work with our EU partners to sort that out.
Dougan.
Mr. Speaker.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I will answer questions 7 and 8 together. I hosted Foreign Minister Dimitri Kuleba in London in December. I speak to him regularly, and I'll be visiting Ukraine next week. A further military incursion by Russia into Ukraine would be a massive strategic mistake and come with a severe cost on Russia's economy, including coordinated sanctions.
Dave Dougan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to hear about the bilateral discussions between the UK and Kiev. But with the threat of very serious conflict looming over Europe, what meetings has the Foreign Secretary held in recent days with the Prime Minister to discuss this crisis? And can she expand on the intellectual heft or geostrategic advice he applied to her at these meetings?
Well, I met the Prime Minister last night to discuss this very serious issue. He had a call with President Biden, President Macron and Chancellor Scholz to continue to coordinate our efforts. Yesterday I met the Secretary General of Nato to talk about the contribution the United Kingdom is making. I can assure you the UK is absolutely at the forefront of putting pressure on Russia and supporting our friends in Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the Secretary of State may be limited in what she can say in response to my question, but the use of propaganda in deceit and warfare is as old as the Trojan horse, but nowadays it can reach millions in a matter of minutes from very heavily disguised sources. So can the Secretary of State assure the House that her government acknowledges the wide-ranging nature of the Russian threat, and tell us what role UK experts are playing with NATO allies and Ukrainian counterparts to combat the hostile use of very powerful and far-reaching misinformation campaigns?
Well, the Honourable Lady makes a very important point that as well as the risk of an incursion into Ukraine, there is also efforts by the Russian government to try and destabilise and undermine democracy. That is why we released intelligence to expose Russian attempts to install a puppet regime in Kiev, and we will continue to expose their playbook, including false flag operations and also disinformation and cyber attacks.
Tom Tugundar.
Speaker, I very much welcome the comments that my right honourable friend has made. She will be aware that the Foreign Affairs Committee was in Ukraine last week, and I'd like to place on record my thanks to Ambassador Simmons and her extremely impressive team in Kiev, who are serving our country extremely well. We're off to Sarajevo tomorrow. Would she agree with me that what we're seeing coming from Moscow at the moment is an arc of instability designed to put democracies on the back foot and to make Putin's regime look normal in a world of corrupt thieves? Would she reiterate her stance in the defence of freedom and promise to speak to our German friends about their recent decisions not to support Ukraine with the sale of military weapons from Estonia that was so recently denied?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right about the undermining that Russia is seeking to do of European democracy, including Ukraine, including their activities through Belarus, including their activities in the Balkans. And that's why we've appointed Sir Stuart Peach as our envoy to the Balkans, and why I hosted a meeting of all of the Balkans ministers to discuss this issue. And we do need all of our allies to step up. The UK is providing defensive weapons to Ukraine. We're supporting Ukraine economically. We're helping train their armed forces. And we need all of our allies to get behind that, because ultimately we do not want to see a Russian incursion into Ukraine, which would lead to huge loss of life, a huge quagmire, and we need to make Russia absolutely clear about that.
Alex Shelbrett.
Speaker, and just building on my right honourable friend's answer there, what assessment does her department make of other surrounding nations of Russia and their territorial and sovereign integrity? I'm especially thinking of Azerbaijan, Armenia, and is there any assessment as to whether the actions going on in Ukraine are being assessed as to whether the West would take any intervention of Russian invasion in those areas?
Well, my honourable friend is making a very good point, and we're working with allies and partners across the world, because this is not just a threat to Europe. This is a threat to broader global stability. I was at a meeting of the OSCE, where many of those countries were represented in November, and I saw very strong statements against further Russian action in the region.
Come to the Shadow Foreign Secretary, David Lammy.
Mr. Speaker, as we stand here today, peace in Europe faces its greatest threat in decades. Our darkest moments in history have taught us that aggression must be challenged and bullies must be confronted. Putin's imperialism must be met with our utmost strength and resolve. 28 years ago, Britain, America and Russia promised that if Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, its sovereignty would be assured. Putin has already run roughshod over that by annexing Crimea and backing separatists in the Donbass. Now he threatens UK with full invasion. Can I ask the Secretary of State, at a time when arms control treaties have unravelled and non-proliferation efforts are under great strain, what message would it send to other countries in the world with nuclear ambitions, like Iran, if those assurances to Ukraine were worth nothing?
Well, the right honourable gentleman makes an extremely good point. In the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, where Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear weapons, it was in exchange for the continued protection of its sovereignty and territorial integrity. And it is absolutely right that this is not just about European security, which is, of course, incredibly important. It is also about the response we will see from other authoritarian regimes around the world if Putin is allowed to get away with what he is seeking to do. That is why it's important we work with allies from Japan to India to Australia, as well as the United States and our NATO allies, to strengthen our resolve, to strengthen our security, and make it absolutely clear that none of these regimes will succeed.
David Lammy.
Mr. Speaker, we owe it to the people of Ukraine to send a simple and united message. We support their sovereign democratic right to choose their own destiny, and we will stand with them in this struggle against Putin's reckless aggression. And we send a firm message to Putin, an unambiguous message, that any aggression will come at a high price. So can the Secretary of State assure me that any Russian military incursion or attack will be met with a full package of sanctions, unprecedented in depth and severity, cutting Russia out of the global financial system, blocking ruble conversion, halting exports of semiconductors, and finally clamping down on the oligarchs who hide their ill-gotten wealth in this capital city.
Well, I strongly agree, again, with the honourable gentleman. We will be making sure that we have the wherewithal to have a very severe package of sanctions in the case of any Russian incursion into Ukraine. And we've been working with allies like the United States, like France and Germany, to put that together. That's why we brought people together at the G7 in Liverpool, where we said there would be severe economic consequences of an incursion into Ukraine. It's important at this moment that we see all of our partners around the world step up. We are leading by example, but we want to see others follow that example.
Davidson.
Please, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, we are building a network of security partnerships to protect our people, our partners and our freedoms. My right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, has already outlined a number of interactions she has had at the multilateral and bilateral level. These echo conversations that the Prime Minister has had. Last week, she was in Australia alongside the Defence Secretary for talks with our Australian counterparts. And on 12th of January, I myself was at NATO alongside European and Atlantic allies for the NATO-Russia Council. As the Foreign Secretary has made clear, we are working through these partnerships to advance our interests from a position of strength.
For his response, and I am very proud of the firm support that the UK has shown for Ukraine as we see the increasingly unstable and threatening behaviour from Russia. Can my right honourable friend confirm that as Russia's threatening behaviour continues and intensifies towards Ukraine, that he and indeed all ministers are working with our global partners to encourage even further support for Ukraine?
Mr. Speaker, I can absolutely confirm that our support for Ukraine is discharged both bilaterally in terms of training teams and defensive military equipment support, but we also support Ukraine through the work that we do at multinational levels, both through the Quad, which I attended recently, whether it be through NATO or other international institutions like the G7, for example, to ensure that all countries support the principles of self-determination, territorial integrity and peace and freedom.
Chair of the Select Committee, Sarah Champion.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, as the world becomes more dangerous and more uncertain, we need to be tackling the root causes of security threats to the UK, namely poverty and instability overseas. I therefore find it very concerning that spending allocations for the Conflict Stability and Security Fund show huge reductions to aid programmes around the world for this financial year. For example, a 63% drop in funding in the Middle East and North Africa, and the Western Balkans reduced by 53%. Does the Minister agree that the government's cuts are compromising on UK security and global stability throughout overseas development? And what will they do to address this?
Mr. Speaker, we in this House have spoken at length about the economic impact that the country, indeed the world, has felt from COVID. That has forced us to temporarily reduce our ODA expenditure. We have had confirmation that we will return to 0.7%. The historic reductions, my right honourable friend the Foreign Secretary has made clear in key areas such as humanitarian and women and girls, we are going to ensure that money is returned to the budgets. In terms of future budget allocations, that process has not been concluded, and until it has been, any talk about figures can only be speculative on her part.
Whilst all eyes have been on Ukraine, can I, my right honourable friend will be aware that due to recent Russian naval activity, Sweden has taken the decision to send hundreds of troops and arms to the island of Gotland in the Baltic. So can I ask what the government is doing to support our Baltic and Nordic countries who very much feel that they themselves are in the front line against Russian aggression?
Mr. Speaker, I can confirm the Defence Secretary has been doing a lot of work in this area. My right honourable friend the Foreign Secretary was in Riga not so long ago. We absolutely recognise that our northern partners, the Baltic states, the Scandinavian countries, are in a geographically difficult and vulnerable place, and I can assure him, and indeed I can assure them, that our support for freedom, democracy and peace extends to that part of the world, as well as more high-profile issues such as Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Number 12.
Mr. Speaker, I can assure her, the Honourable Lady, and indeed the House, that we remain committed to securing the immediate and permanent release of those British dual nationals unfairly detained in Iran. We continue to work together with our international partners. The Foreign Secretary, my right honourable friend, pressed the Iranian Foreign Minister on the 8th of November for Anousheh Shouri, Morad Tabaz and Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe to be released and to return home to be with their families as soon as possible. I raised their cases with my Iranian counterpart, Deputy Foreign Minister Baghari Khani, on the 11th of November, and we continue to call on Iran to do the right thing and allow the immediate release and return home of these British dual nationals.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank the Minister for his answer? But that was November. Anousheh Shouri is on a hunger strike and he needs diplomatic protection. He's innocent. Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, 6 years a hostage, innocent. Morad Tabaz, an environmentalist, innocent. Mehran Rauf, a trade unionist, innocent. Will the Minister commit to working closely with the United States Special Envoy, Robert Malley, and bring these innocent hostages home?
Mr. Speaker, I would remind her, and the point I have made before, that our department works tirelessly, daily, in our attempts to bring these people home. And we do so not because questions are raised in the House or sent to us in correspondence, but because it is the right thing to do and is what we are committed to do. We work tirelessly with international partners, both in the region and across the Atlantic, to bring about the release of these people whose detention is completely illegitimate, completely wrong, and is the sole responsibility of the Iranian government. They are the ones who are in the position to release these people, and we call upon them to do so immediately.
14, please, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, with permission, I will answer questions 14 and 20 together. A negotiated political settlement is the only way to bring long-term stability to Yemen. On 10th of January, I hosted UN Special Envoy for Yemen, Hans Grunberg, here in London, and reiterated the UK support for the UN-led peace process and to drive forward a political process in Yemen. We urge the parties to engage constructively in negotiations and to end this conflict, which is bringing death and suffering at an appalling scale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Minister for that answer, but this brutal conflict is in its 9th year. Recent deadly coalition-led attacks on children and civilians have rightly been condemned by the UN General Secretary. As the UK are penholders at the UN for Yemen, does he believe the continued sale of arms from the UK and the recent withdrawal of UK aid is helping or hindering diplomatic efforts?
Mr. Speaker, the amount of money that the UK has allocated and distributed in Yemen has helped protect lives, to feed children. I'm incredibly proud of the work that we have done. The simple fact of the matter, however, is that we cannot properly help the people of Yemen until this conflict has come to a conclusion. That's why we continue to work with the United Nations Special Envoy Hans Grunberg, and I would remind her that aggression has been perpetrated by the Houthis, both within Yemen and across the borders, both into Saudi Arabia and to the United Arab Emirates. We call upon the Houthis to lay down their arms, engage with the peace process, so we can bring peace to Yemen and properly help the Yemeni people lift themselves out of poverty.
Fairness. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The situation in Yemen continues to deteriorate and attacks are ever more brutal. Just last week, 3 children who were out playing football were among 60 people killed when missiles struck Hodeidah and Sadr. Does the Minister agree that this demonstrates the importance of re-establishing the group of eminent experts, and what fresh efforts does he believe are needed within the UN Security Council to end this terrible conflict?
Mr. Speaker, the loss of life, the recent loss of life in Yemen and actually in the nations surrounding Yemen that have received attacks emanating from the Houthis is terrible. And ultimately, the best thing that we can do as a leading member of the international community and the penholder of the United Nations is to push for peace in Yemen. I have in the past done that directly with the Houthi leadership. We have done that indirectly through countries in the region that have some degree of influence with the Houthis. And of course, we have these discussions directly with both the government of Yemen and governments in surrounding countries. It will remain a priority for this government to pursue peace through the United Nations Special Envoy and others, so that we can set that country on a road to recovery and out of the hell that it currently finds itself in.
Minister Bambashaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We were all horrified by the atrocities of the airstrike on Friday, which led to dozens of deaths and was another horrific incident in this conflict. And this adds to one of the world's greatest humanitarian disasters, with an estimated 20 million Yemenis in need of assistance. As the Minister knows, the Saudi air and sea blockade means that hardly any humanitarian aid is getting through. And so I ask the Minister, what influence is the government using to help bring about a peace conference to end the blockade so that people on the brink of starvation can get the humanitarian aid that they need?
Mr. Speaker, I have in the past spoken both with the government of Yemen and countries in the region to ensure that fuel supplies that are needed both to transport grain and also mill grain for bread have been made available. And I'm pleased that the UK intervention at those times brought about or facilitated rather, the distribution of aid to Yemen. He raises the loss of life that has been experienced, and I would remind him that the only way to meaningfully reduce the loss of life, both within Yemen and in the nations around Yemen, is for the parties to get to the negotiating table, and that means the Houthis. That means the Houthis, and we will continue to support the United Nations Special Envoy in his work to bring that about.
Now come to short and punchy topicals, James Sunderland.
As talks number one, please. Number one.
Mr. Speaker, together with our allies, we are standing up to Russian aggression. We will not tolerate their campaign of hybrid warfare aiming to destabilise democracies across Eastern Europe. We will continue to expose Russian disinformation, including attempts to install proxies and puppets. The UK is at the forefront of providing support to Ukraine with defensive weapons and through economics and trade. Any Russian military incursion would be a massive strategic mistake with severe costs. The Ukrainians will fight, and Putin should beware an intractable quagmire.
James Sunderland.
Mr. Speaker, as talks continue in Vienna on reviving the JCPOA nuclear deal, there are fears that Iran gets ever closer to a nuclear weapon. Can my right honourable friend please convince the House of what's happening to maintain peace in the Middle East?
This negotiation is urgent and progress has not been fast enough. We continue to work in close partnership with our allies, but the negotiations are reaching a dangerous impasse. Iran must now choose whether it wants to conclude a deal or be responsible for the collapse of the JCPOA. And if the JCPOA collapses, all options are on the table.
Minister Lynn Brown.
I'm grateful, Mr. Speaker. 9.4 million are going hungry in northern Ethiopia. Airstrikes are killing civilians and the blockade is being used as a political weapon. I'm glad that the Minister met with Abiy Ahmed last week. Can I ask if she made clear that preventing humanitarian access is an abuse of human rights, that airstrikes on refugees are completely and utterly incompatible with UK partnership, and a real dialogue to enable peace must start now and include the Prime Minister's opponents?
Well, the Honourable Lady is absolutely right. We do need to secure peace in Ethiopia. My honourable friend, the Minister, was in Ethiopia and she's been extremely active on the issue. I have also discussed this issue with the Ethiopian Foreign Minister and urged them to join peace talks.
Henry Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When I was in Ukraine last week, the senior government officials and military commanders wanted me to express the sincere gratitude that country has for the support that the United Kingdom is providing. What assessments has my right honourable friend made of the involvement of the regime in Belarus in terms of supporting Russian threats to Ukraine?
I thank my honourable friend for his question. The world is aware that Russia is on manoeuvres both on the borders of Ukraine and across Belarus, and we are always continually developing our assessment of the situation, and I can only repeat what my honourable friends have said about this massive strategic mistake Russia would make were it to invade the territorial borders of Ukraine.
Rachel Maskell.
Mr. Speaker, just 5.5% of people in low-income families are still vaccinated from COVID-19, this meaning disaster for so many nations. Why is the government blocking the patent when manufacturing of the vaccine in country could save millions of lives? The government's donation is simply a drop in the ocean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Throughout the pandemic, our top priority has been to save lives. We firmly believe the best way to do this is to support the world's leading scientists. There is no evidence that the IP rights waiver would help save lives. That the TRIPS waiver proposal would dismantle the international IP framework that helped to produce the vaccines at an unprecedented pace.
Well,
thank you, Mr. Speaker. People in Dudley South and across Britain with vivid memories of the famines that followed civil war in the 1980s in Ethiopia will look with horror at recent reports from that country now. What update can my honourable friend give on the situation in Ethiopia and on the prospects for a lasting peace?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right. The war in northern Ethiopia has caused huge suffering, but there are some welcome signs that it may now be possible to move towards peace. So I visited Ethiopia last week and met with Prime Minister Abiy, and I urged the Prime Minister to work towards those peace talks, but also to ensure that humanitarian aid is flowing to those that need it. And we in the UK stand ready to support all efforts towards finding that peace.
Tony Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the country will be astonished about the Minister's answer in terms of the TRIPS waiver. If it's right that nobody's safe until the whole world is vaccinated, how is it that the United States, for example, thinks the TRIPS waiver would allow vaccination to be produced in the right places for the right people? Why are we one of the very few countries sticking out to prevent this?
Well, I'd point out to the honourable gentleman that this is the country where the Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine was developed, which has been supplied at cost across the world. And I've seen it being produced in the Serum Institute in India. I've been seeing it produced in Mexico. The fact is that we have supported the rollout of vaccines across the world and also donated to developing countries.
Yeah. John Penrose.
Mr. Speaker, how does the Foreign Secretary believe that the role of the Commonwealth could and should be developed in future now that the UK has left the EU?
The Commonwealth is a vibrant and valued network of countries, and we are deeply committed to it. Commonwealth nations are crucial friends in delivering the Foreign Secretary's vision of a network of liberty and planting the flag for freedom across the globe. We look forward to hosting the Commonwealth Games in Birmingham this summer and to attending Chobham and Kigali in Rwanda soon.
Speaker, members of the Fair Trade APPG recently met with Bismarck, who's a fair trade producer from Ghana who attended COP26 to explain how climate change was affecting his crops. As we approach Fair Trade Fortnight, can international development ministers outline how a farmer like Bismarck will be able to access the climate adaptation finance pledged by the UK at COP26, which will support producers, tackle climate change and improve food security?
Well, first of all, we're launching the Developing Countries Trading Scheme soon, which is going to help developing countries get better access to the UK market. And we've also just launched British International Investment, which will help developing countries in their climate change adaptation by supporting their investment.
Els Watling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With the leadership of NATO changing in this September, does my honourable friend not think it apposite that the leadership should go to a representative from a country that is actually meeting its defence spending commitments, which is vital to repelling aggressions from states such as Russia?
Mr. Speaker, the UK is very proud to be a long-standing, indeed founding member of NATO and to consistently meet its 2% target. NATO remains one of the most important institutions for Euro-Atlantic security, and I think it's incredibly important that the future leadership of NATO recognises traditional threats, as we are now seeing on the borders of Ukraine, but also emerging threats such as cyber, such as space, and in other realms of conflict.
Marshall Cordell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week saw the first eviction of a Palestinian family in Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem in 5 years. Demolitions of Palestinian homes in occupied territories have increased by 21% in 2021, and currently 200 more Palestinian families have eviction orders and are at risk of being displaced. The forced evictions of Palestinians must stop. So will the Minister condemn these demolitions, and what action will he take to stop further evictions of Palestinian families in Sheikh Jarrah?
Mr. Speaker, I forgive the honourable lady for not being a devoted follower of my social media feeds and statement. I have already put out a statement with regard to those demolitions. As I said in response to an earlier question, the UK enjoys an incredibly and strong relationship with Israel that allows us to bring up difficult and sensitive issues such as this, but also enables us to work with them on areas of mutual interest and concern, including, ultimately, a viable two-state solution.
I very strongly welcome the strength and determination of the messages which the Foreign Secretary is sending to Mr Putin to deter any possible aggression against the Ukraine. It's just right. However, are there any circumstances under which she could foresee British troops being deployed in a combat role defending Ukraine?
As the Defence Secretary has already said, it is unlikely that that would be the circumstance. But what we are doing is working very hard to make sure that Ukraine has the defensive weapons it needs, that it has the training it needs. We've trained 20,000 Ukrainian personnel, and also that it has the support of the international community. We're pushing our allies very hard to make sure they are offering similar defensive support.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Foreign Secretary has concluded a trade deal with Australia which advantages those who produce their food using animal welfare standards far worse than Cumbrian farmers or British farmers in general. So when will those of us who care about farming and animal welfare standards get the chance to vote on that deal?
Well, unlike the honourable gentleman, I have faith in Cumbrian farmers, and I believe that they are world-beating, and Cumbrian lamb is world-beating. So I'd encourage the honourable gentleman to get behind the new trade deal we're negotiating, the CPTPP. Why doesn't he go out to the Asia-Pacific region and actually promote his farmers rather than talking them down in the House of Commons?
Sir Rep. The Minister will be aware that I've raised repeatedly the case of Mara Shabazz, a 14-year-old Christian girl forcibly abducted, raped and forced into a marriage. Will the Minister assure me that, given that we give hundreds of millions of pounds in aid to Pakistan, that we are insisting this aid is contingent on reform of the blasphemy laws and making sure that there are no forced conversions in that country? Good question.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman will understand why I won't go into specific details of that case, I can assure him that both in our bilateral relationships with Pakistan and other countries where we are aid donors, we also ensure that we use that relationship to promote the values of tolerance, but not just tolerance, protection of religious freedom. That is as true in Pakistan as it is in other areas, and I know this is an issue that my noble friend Lord Ahmed raises bilaterally.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What more evidence does the Foreign Secretary need to take sanctions against General Silva, the Chief of the Defence in Sri Lanka, to follow the American government in those sanctions for war crimes?
We regularly engage with the US and other partners on issues relating to Sri Lanka. The UK government keeps all evidence and potential designations under the UK Global Human Rights Sanctions regime under close review, guided by the objectives of the sanctions regime. We would not normally speculate about future sanctions targets, as to do so would reduce their impact.
Andrew Rosenberg.
Mr. Speaker, the Chinese Communist Party is expanding its grip over the people of Hong Kong, destroying the freedoms and liberties defended by the British Crown for 100 years. Will the Foreign Secretary join me in condemning China for its flagrant misuse of power and undermining the rule of law?
Yeah. We continue to make clear to mainland Chinese and Hong Kong authorities our strong opposition to the national security law, which is being used to curtail freedoms, punish dissent and shrink the space for opposition, free press and civil society. As a co-signatory to the joint declaration, we will continue to stand up for the people of Hong Kong.
Chairman.
Mr. Speaker, good to be back after my brush with COVID. But could I say to the Secretary of State that it couldn't be more topical. This morning we've seen crises around the world, particularly our problems on the border with Russia. Isn't it a fact, though, I've been in this House the longest on these benches, and in those years, when we have this sort of crisis, you expect to see a Prime Minister not on the phone, not on video calls, but out there visiting, talking, organising, showing leadership that we care and we lead from the front. Please knock on number 10 and say, get him out of there. And I hope he doesn't say, crisis, what crisis?
We have been leading on the response to Ukraine. Only last night, the Prime Minister was on a call with the President of the United States, the President of France and the Chancellor of Germany. We are showing leadership in providing defensive support to Ukraine, in putting in place the toughest economic sanctions in the case of a Russian incursion. And I encourage the honourable gentleman to put his points to the Russian President.
We now come to the urgent question. I call the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, Angela Rayner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, to ask the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster to make a statement on the status of the investigation into Downing Street parties following the statement from the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police.
Michael Ellis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, as the House will be aware, earlier today the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police confirmed that the Metropolitan Police Service will be investigating alleged breaches of COVID-19 regulations within government. This is a matter for the police, and the House will understand that I'm not in a position to comment on the nature or content of the police investigation. Mr. Speaker, I have previously made clear from this dispatch box that the government recognises, and I recognise, the public anxiety and indignation that it appears as though the people who have been setting the rules may not have been following the rules. And I would like to repeat that sentiment today. And this is why the Prime Minister asked for a Cabinet Office investigation to take place. The terms of reference for that investigation, led by the Second Permanent Secretary at the Cabinet Office and the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, Sue Gray, have been published and laid in the library of this House. Those terms made clear that, as with all internal investigations, Mr. Speaker, if during the course of the work any evidence emerges of behaviour that is potentially a criminal offence, the matter will be referred to the police and the Cabinet Office's work may be paused. Mr. Speaker, as the House would expect, there is ongoing contact between the Cabinet Office investigation and the Metropolitan Police Service. However, the Cabinet Office investigation will continue its work. I would urge the House to wait for the findings of that investigation and for the police to conclude their work. That is important to allow the work to take place unimpeded and to protect the rights of all involved. Mr. Speaker, I must emphasise that matters relating to adherence of the law are properly a matter for the police to investigate, and the Cabinet Office will liaise with them as appropriate. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I can confirm that the findings of the investigation will be provided to this Honourable House and made public. Mr. Speaker, the House will understand that there is a limit to what I can say, given this is an ongoing investigation. I also cannot comment on what is now an ongoing police investigation, and therefore I ask that members of the House let the investigation run its course and do not preempt its conclusions.
Angela Rayner.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for granting this urgent question. And well, all too soon, the Minister and I find ourselves here once again, rather than dealing with the cost of living crisis impacting on families, we're talking about scandals in Downing Street again. And the members opposite can chunter from their positions, but they're allowing this to happen, Mr. Speaker. 2 months now, Cabinet Ministers have been working hard to make Sue Gray the most famous woman in Britain. In response to every question asked about the poor conduct, bad behaviour and rule-breaking culture that this government has overseen, the ministers have repeatedly told us Sue Gray is the answer. Now there's a police investigation, and the terms of reference for Sue Gray set by the Prime Minister himself are clear. If any evidence emerges of behaviour that is potentially a criminal offence, the matter will be referred to the police. So it seems, Mr. Speaker, potential criminality has been found in Downing Street. What a truly damning reflection on our nation's very highest office. So I ask the Minister, given this morning's announcement, when will the Sue Gray report finally be published? Can he assure the House that the Sue Gray report will be published in full, not just the summary, and will the accompanying evidence be provided? And can he clarify for the House what Sue Gray and her team will be doing whilst the police conduct their investigation? Can the Minister confirm whether the decision to delay the publication of the Sue Gray report was made by the Metropolitan Police or the government? Given this government's record, Mr. Speaker, on lost phones, missing messages and minutes, can he assure the House that all evidence from the Gray inquiry will be properly held by the Cabinet Office? Can he clarify if the Chancellor, as a resident of Downing Street, is cooperating fully with the Gray inquiry and if the police investigation, and has he been interviewed? Just weeks ago, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister told this House there was no party. How does the Paymaster General explain that? I know across the country people know enough. They have made up their minds about the Prime Minister, so when will his party catch up?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I will agree with her first point. Her first point was, why aren't we talking about cost of living? Well, the Prime Minister right now is working on cost of living. He's working on Russia, Ukraine. He is doing those jobs, and the Prime Minister is focused on those areas. Mr. Speaker, I think she also, in her second point, forgets that the word potentially was used. The reality of the matter is that the fact that the police are investigating the matter does not draw any conclusions. If she looks at the statement issued by the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Cressida Dick, she has said that, stressed the fact that the Met is investigating does not mean that it will necessarily result in fixed penalty notices in every instance and to every person involved. So potentially is a key and operative word, and she wants to jump to conclusions, but she asks about the details of the investigation. Those are, of course, matters for the Cabinet Office and matters for the police. They're not details of which I would be informed. I wouldn't expect to be informed because the police have independent operational assessment of matters that are before them, and they will conduct the matter as they see fit.
Sir Edward Lee.
When Europe stands on the brink of war and there is a cost of living crisis, can we please have a sense of proportion over the Prime Minister being given a piece of cake in his own office by his own staff?
I completely agree.
Mr. Speaker, on Burns Day, it's probably appropriate we should start with the line, "The best laid plans o' mice and men gang after gley." Or perhaps a line from the other great Scottish writer, Sir Walter Scott, "Oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practise to deceive." I do wonder, Mr. Speaker, now that the police are finally involved, how much more personal humiliation and indignity will the Prime Minister be prepared to endure? But perhaps more importantly, how much more of this embarrassing circus are his colleagues prepared to tolerate before they act to remove this man from office? Because this isn't going to go away. This wound is not going to heal miraculously by itself, and I'm sure we all know there's an awful lot more still to come out. So can I ask the Minister, at any time, has anyone from the Sugri inquiry contacted the Metropolitan Police? When did the Cabinet Office first learn of this police investigation? When does he now expect the Sugri report to be delivered? And finally, can he assure this House that when it is delivered, that it will be delivered in full, will be open and will be completely transparent for every member of this House to access?
Well, he asks me questions about the police investigation, and I have no knowledge about that, and nor would I expect or should I have knowledge about it. And he asks about the publication, and I have already indicated that the findings of the investigation will be published.
Carper.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask the Paymaster General, I accept he may not be able to answer this question now, but can he assure the House that he will keep, either he or other ministers will keep the House posted about whether the Prime Minister is going to be interviewed by the Metropolitan Police either as a witness or as a potential suspect in this criminal investigation?
Well, I thank him for his question, but of course the police will conduct the investigation, as they do in any case, entirely at their own discretion, and I would not expect to be informed about that, nor would the House expect me to be.
Maria Riedel.
There have been newspaper reports of Downing Street staff being told to delete evidence of parties from their phones, and staff fearing to give evidence to the Sue Gray inquiry for fear that the PM will see it and there'll later be recriminations. So now that there's a police investigation, will the Paymaster General make it clear throughout Whitehall that all evidence must be given to the police, and will he undertake to publish the report and evidence so that we can all see at the end of this affair that it has been done?
Well, I think one can draw a conclusion, if I may say so, from the fact that the Cabinet Office, in their liaison with the Metropolitan Police, have, according to the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, satisfied her that an investigation should take place, and that should give comfort to those who might otherwise doubt the investigation, that it is a proper and due process investigation. And as in all cases where due process should be followed in the interests of fairness, it would not be appropriate to presuppose any result of a police investigation, or for that matter, of an independent Cabinet Office investigation. And as I've already said, I would expect the findings to be published in due course.
Shelley's father.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that it is a long-standing convention in this House that when there are independent inquiries and investigations, they are allowed to run their course and prejudgments aren't made in this House. Yeah. Given that is the case, and it would be advisable that that convention be carried on, would my right honourable friend also agree with me that we really do need to concentrate on matters that really affect our constituents on a day-to-day basis? Cost of living, energy prices and so on, as well as the fact that there are 100,000 Russian troops on the Ukrainian border, which threatens global instability.
He makes a powerful point about the pressing international situation, particularly as regards Ukraine and Russia. And I know the Prime Minister is focused on that matter. I also understand the anxiety and indignation of many who are frustrated by the reports that have been emanating over a course of many weeks about alleged gatherings in the Downing Street area. The reality of the matter is the Prime Minister is focused, as he has been focused, on delivering for this country, as he's succeeded in delivering vaccines, as he's succeeded in delivering on the manifesto commitments, and he'll continue that laser focus.
David. Mr. Speaker, it's clear this government is now in total meltdown. Story after story about COVID laws being broken in Number 10. Revelations about honourable members having constituency funding threatened by government whips, and now a Prime Minister and his staff under police investigation. In the midst of a pandemic and a cost of living crisis, and with Europe on the brink of war in Ukraine, we cannot go on with this chaotic government. No. Does the Minister accept that the Prime Minister's authority is in tatters? Will he advise his boss to do the right thing in the national interest and resign?
Minister.
Well, I thank him for his advice on propriety, but he will forgive me. He will forgive me if I decline to follow it.
Teresa Villiers.
Mr. Speaker, will the Minister agree that anyone taking a view on the Prime Minister must take into account the fact that he's presided over the most successful vaccination programme in the world, which is taking us out of this pandemic ahead of most other countries in the world?
She's absolutely right. And we would be in lockdown now were it not for this Prime Minister.
Partying anyway.
It's not standing. Ben Bradshaw.
Mr. Speaker, is the Prime Minister not simply compounding his previous terrible mistakes by continuing to deny culpability, leading to an unnecessary and expensive police inquiry, when he could do the decent thing and resign?
Minister.
I'm sure he would expect fairness to apply to all in this country, whether it be one of his constituents or one of mine. And I would hope and expect that he would not wish to see unfairness to anyone. What we are doing is we are cooperating at the Cabinet Office with a police investigation. That will carry on and take its natural course, as police investigations invariably take their natural course in an orderly way, unencumbered by interference from the executive.
David Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Paymaster General consider the Metropolitan Police or any other police force looking into the activities of the Leader of the Opposition with his Beers party? As far as I can see, there's no difference. What would you say to that, Paymaster?
Minister.
Well, my honourable friend makes an interesting point, but of course police investigations and how they conduct themselves are operationally independent. I'm sure they will have heard what he said.
Pete Wishart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does he not think that it would be a good idea just to set up a police special operations unit and room in Number 10 Downing Street? Because whilst they're looking at this one, they could perhaps look at cash for honours, cash for access, PPE for pals, paid advocacy, breaking the ministerial code, and just all the other general Tory badness.
Minister.
Well, I have to say, a quick Google analysis of the SNP would not be particularly edifying. But what I will say is that despite noises off, this Prime Minister is focused on what matters to the British people, and it's right that these matters conclude in an orderly way.
Reb Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome this investigation. But you can see the absolute terror, the terror on the benches opposite. For this, for them, partygate, they know they're up against a Prime Minister and a government which has brought youth unemployment to its lowest ever level. A government and a Prime Minister, led by the Prime Minister, that of course brought us the AstraZeneca vaccine, has the most successful booster programme in the world, and that is why, opposite absolute terror, that we should focus on policy in this place, focus on the priorities of the British people, and that's why they're so desperate to land this even as the inquiry goes ahead.
I agree completely, Mr. Speaker. The PM also welcomes the announcement by the Met Police today because it's alongside the Sue Gray inquiry, which the PM set up, I might add, that will offer the public the clarity they need to help draw a line under these events.
Andy MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My Middlesbrough constituents have obeyed the rules and done exactly what the Prime Minister demanded of them and abided by the laws that he initiated. Doesn't the Paymaster General understand that the continued refusal to do the right and decent thing only serves to damage our democracy and tarnish our reputation across the world, and that will not be turned around until such time as the Prime Minister goes and brings this shameful business to an end?
Minister.
No, I don't agree with his characterisation.
Mr. Speaker, does the Paymaster agree? Does the Paymaster agree that compared with being interviewed under caution for flogging peerages, as Tony Blair was, compared with trying to prosecute a former First Minister of Scotland when they were told there was no evidence to do so, and compared with taking money from Chinese spies, that eating a piece of birthday cake is a relatively minor offence?
My friend makes his point powerfully and eloquently.
Geraint Davies.
Mr. Speaker, given that the police investigated and intervened in a number of parties across London on the 20th of May, can you explain, at the time enormous amounts of booze has been trundled into number 10 with enormous amounts of noise, why they didn't intervene at the time? And does that make him fear about any sort of fudging of this investigation, and perhaps another police force should intervene?
Yeah. Minister.
Well, I'm sorry he chooses to criticise the Metropolitan Police. I don't think that that would have the support of this House. Look, the position is, Mr. Speaker, that I would ask him to accept that the Metropolitan Police and those public servants who work in government work hard, including over a period of major crisis for this country, in the public service. They're devoted to their work. They seek to serve the public in the best way they can, and assumptions ought not to be made either of police or civil service impropriety. The matter is subject to investigation, and I would ask him to accept, if you like, the default position, Mr. Speaker, that persons are innocent unless otherwise proved. That is how it works.
Jacob Young.
Mr. Speaker, last night NATO announced it was putting troops on standby in response to the situation in Ukraine, and in April gas prices are currently forecast to rise by more than 50% when the energy price cap lifts. What people in Redcar and Cleveland want is to move on from this debacle on parties and focus on the real issues. So can he assure me that the Cabinet Office will publish Sue Gray's report as soon as they are able?
I completely agree with his position, and I would say that the report of Sue Gray will be published, the findings of that report, as soon as they are available.
Janet Chard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Right Honourable Member for Gainsborough invited us to have a sense of proportion in relation to this matter. Can I just refer him to one of the many emails I've had from constituents in Edinburgh South West and ask the Minister what he thinks about it. This constituent said to me, if I hadn't followed the COVID restrictions like the Prime Minister, I would have driven to Norfolk to see my mum after she broke her leg and had to stay in a nursing home. I would have been able to go south to prepare her house. I could have helped cook and clean for her while we found suitable local carers. I could have sung her a happy birthday from the hospital grounds while she recovered from the COVID she caught from a carer. and I could have been with her when she died a few days later, 82 and alone in a ward of strangers. What should I say to my constituent? Should I tell him to have a sense of proportion? Apologise to him and all the other people across the United Kingdom who kept the rules when the Prime Minister and his mates didn't.
Minister.
I would invite her to offer to her constituent my abject sorrow and condolences for his loss. There is nothing that I can say to bring back that loss, but what I can say is that the Prime Minister, in his exercise of his functions over the course of this pandemic, has brought this country out of a dire situation into a situation now where we are leading the world in our arrangements around the pandemic, and where the Prime Minister will continue to focus on those priorities.
Philip Holdebell.
Could I welcome the Metropolitan Police inquiry and express surprise that it wasn't announced earlier? In his previous role as Attorney General, the Paymaster General will be more familiar than most with the COVID-19 regulations and the fixed penalty notices that have been issued. Can he confirm that they are summary offences normally investigated within 6 months and that the burden of proof is beyond reasonable doubt?
Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for his question. I would prefer not to get into the legal position, as he can imagine, but what I would say is that I would expect, as would everyone, the police to conduct their investigation expeditiously, and they will do so at a time that, no doubt, is in accordance with their own procedures and protocols. He is right to raise the fact that there will be tests, evidence and burden of proof, and it is always right, of course, that a person in this country is innocent unless or until they be proven guilty.
I'm expecting to run this to about 1:15 so we can help each other by speeding through. Debbie Abrahams.
Mr. Speaker, what assessment has been undertaken on the damage that partygate has on our economy, on inward investment and on the trust that the British people have with this government?
Minister.
Well, can I invite, she asks what assessment has been made. Can I invite the House to note that this Prime Minister held a cabinet meeting the day after his own mother died, that he was working just weeks after he himself had been released from intensive care in hospital, that he has led the world on AstraZeneca, on vaccine availability, and we would still be in a lockdown situation if it were not for him. So I would invite her to accept those points are the points that will really focus the mind.
Giles Watling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that there are ongoing investigations by Sue Gray and the Metropolitan Police at this time, and we await those results, does my right honourable friend not agree that this urgent question itself is a vexatious waste of everybody's time?
The allowance of urgent questions are a matter...
Can I just say to the Minister, I'm sure he's not going to question my judgment because I'm the person that grants them, and I'm sure he'd like to withdraw that step, and it does need answering.
Mr. Speaker, at your behest, I withdraw the question.
Absolutely. Right, Alison Thewlis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. One of my constituents, Billie Jean, was in touch. Billie Jean was in university accommodation during the pandemic and was fined £100 for having a gathering of 11 people during that pandemic. Billie Jean says that while they were being fined and disciplined by their university, the Prime Minister was living a lush life of champagne and party nibbles. Would the Minister like to apologise to my constituents and everybody else for having done one thing in Downing Street while people in the world outside have done quite another?
No, her constituent would either, in order to have been fined, would either have had to admit wrongdoing or been found guilty in a court of law on the evidence before that court. So the situation is completely different. No such state of affairs exists as far as number 10 is concerned to the Prime Minister.
Mr. Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I fought in bloody conflicts in Europe, and at the moment we're seeing hundreds of thousands of Russian troops on the Ukrainian border, what could see the bloodiest conflict for generations. We're wasting time here, and every time the Sorry, Mr. Speaker. Every time the opposition call for our Prime Minister to resign, does my right honourable friend agree that we're only strengthening Putin's hand and destabilising negotiations?
He is quite right to focus on what matters around the world and indeed to the Prime Minister of this country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Every day in my constituency of Birkenhead, parents are going hungry so that their children can eat, while elderly people are living in freezing homes because they simply can't afford to put the heating on. Will the Minister concede that this government is more interested by its own internal turmoil than in helping the most in need? And will he now join calls to the Prime Minister to step aside so that we can finally begin to get to grips with this Tory cost of living?
Minister.
As I said in this House last time, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is going nowhere.
Martin Docker to use.
Last night, Mr. Speaker, the food critic Jay Rayner quoted the late, great Julia Childs, who once said, "A party without a cake is just a meeting. Johnson's staffers supplied a cake, ergo, it was a party." I wonder if the Paymaster General agrees not only with Jay Rayner, but the late, great Julia Childs.
You're a pudding with that,
Minister. Well, if whilst at work someone eats a cake for 10 minutes, I don't think conclusions can be drawn from that. So he is putting the horse before the cart, or the cart before the horse, or whatever the phrase.
Jenkinson.
Mr. Speaker, is it not the case that the opposition benches are in cahoots with media to undemocratically depose this Prime Minister, not because he's an electoral liability for them, for us, but because he's an electoral liability for them?
Minister.
Well, one has to wonder the focus of the party opposite on gatherings from 2 years ago, as alleged, when they're not focused on the Ukraine, on massing troops, Russian troops at the border of Europe, is quite extraordinary. What we're doing is we're focusing on the matters that really make a difference to the people of this country, whilst the police and the Cabinet Office continue their investigation.
Gardner.
What an insult.
Given that it has taken 6 weeks since the Mirror first broke the story of parties in Downing Street to have a police inquiry, what consideration has the government given to appointing Pippa Crerar as the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police?
Well, I have no reason to be concerned about who the Metropolitan Police Commissioner is.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the weekend and the last couple of days, I've been out and about with my constituents in Great Grimsby, and they are sick and tired of listening to this constant thread. And they are happy, very happy, that essential workers have gathered together for 2 years to get us through this pandemic. And would my right honourable friend send a message to the Prime Minister that they support his policies and they want him to carry on getting on with the job?
I will gladly send that message to the Prime Minister, and in fact her message is very similar to messages that the Prime Minister is hearing from our colleagues around this House, and that is the focus that it matters.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And does the Minister really think that it is in the interests of our country, not the Prime Minister, that he remain at the helm, giving public health advice to the people of Newcastle and security reassurances to the people of Ukraine, whilst mired in scandal and facing criminal investigation?
Minister.
I do, passionately. I think the Prime Minister is the best leader for this country, and he would bring to shame the party opposite and any offer that they might have as a leader of this country. The Prime Minister knows what matters. He focuses on the matters that are important to the British people. This investigation is also important, but it is being conducted by the Cabinet Office and the Metropolitan Police. We recognise the upset that has been caused by these allegations, and they are being properly investigated.
Alexander.
Speaker. I know myself, colleagues and constituents were shocked by alleged lockdown rule breaking by none other than the leader of the opposition, the right honourable, my gallant friend, Keir Starmer. Does my honourable friend agree with me that there can be no hypocrisy and all sides need to be investigated? Because after all, those in glass houses shouldn't throw beer bottles.
I'm sure hypocrisy wasn't aimed at an individual member, surely not. Minister, I think it's badly phrased. Now,
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, nothing in the law forbade people who were legitimately and genuinely at work from having a 10-minute coffee break in between meetings. And I'm sure people were doing that around the country, whether they ate cake with it or not. The reality of the matter is that his point was completely accurate.
Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Home Affairs Select Committee has been following the issue of the consistency of enforcement of COVID regulations, as we are well aware of how failure to do so can erode public trust. And the Home Affairs Select Committee will have an opportunity to ask questions of the Metropolitan Commissioner soon. But as the police have primary responsibility for criminal investigations in this country, does the Minister think that it would have been much better to have passed this on to the Metropolitan Police as soon as these allegations came to light, and that we would now be concluding that investigation by the Metropolitan Police, and he would have to stop coming to this House of Commons to defend the Prime Minister?
Well,
Minister,
I know that the Honourable Lady is a very fair chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, and she will acknowledge that the police have their job to do. It is not a matter for the government or the executive to refer matters. That has been done by the Cabinet Office independently as part of their investigation. And as to the length of the police investigation, we have no idea how long that will be.
Mike Wood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's clearly correct that the police should investigate any suspicions of breaches of the law, regardless of who may be involved. Can my right honourable friend assure this House and the country that Sue Gray is being left to conduct her investigation independently and freely, and that there are no barriers to her passing any information she may find that is relevant onto the police about any potential rule breaking?
Minister.
Yes, I can confirm that, and in fact, the fact that the Cabinet Office has passed matters to the Metropolitan Police is proven by today's news.
Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Minister explain to his less quick-witted colleagues that claimed good works on COVID are no excuse for breaking the law?
Well, no one is proved to have done what he alleges.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is absolutely right for there to be a full investigation into these matters, just as it was in terms of the police investigation into the Cash for Honours scandal under the Blair government. And can my right honourable friend assure me that the police will of course be given full cooperation in these matters, as they have been during the Cabinet Office investigation process?
Minister.
I can assure my friend that full cooperation will be accorded to the police as and if they ask for it.
Brendan McNeill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's quite clear that even after measures, the Prime Minister doesn't want to leave 10 Downing Street. But don't we face the possibility in the UK that the UK's PM might eventually be leaving 10 Downing Street in police handcuffs?
Minister.
No.
Justin Mathers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the 8th of December, the Prime Minister told this House, and I quote, "There was no party." Paragraph 1.3 of the Ministerial Code says anyone who knowingly misleads the House will be expected to resign. So why is the Prime Minister still in his job?
Minister.
Well, if a group of people gather for work, whilst at work they take cake for 10 minutes, then everyone working is permitted reasonable breaks as a part of their working day. So that's one possible interpretation. 10 minutes of eating cake and wishing someone a happy birthday would not a party make. But it is a matter for police investigation, and that is now what's happening.
Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Paymaster General for his response to the questions. Each day it now does seem to feel like there are new reports of a suspected lockdown breach. I am pleased, however, that investigations are underway by the Met Police. Can the Paymaster General confirm that any and all findings from these investigations will be disclosed to the media for public reassurance, and that this will be the case for all potential reports of breaches that may yet come before Sue Gray's investigations are included, and that justice will be done.
Minister.
I can assure him that the findings of Sue Gray's report will be put before this House.
Alex Davidson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, the Paymaster General has been forced to come to the dispatch box to defend the indefensible, and no one is buying it. Honesty, transparency and leadership should be at the heart of this country's government, but it is severely lacking. So will the Prime Minister now come to this House to set the record straight, tell us exactly what gatherings and parties he attended at Downing Street, or better yet, will he just resign?
Well, I know she wishes to make political points, Mr. Speaker, but and it's kind of her to focus on my comfort, but I'm not forced to do anything. I'm here because I know the Prime Minister is entitled to the same justice as anyone else. And as far as the opposition are concerned, Mr. Speaker, it's unedifying to make party political points over this matter. The focus of this government is on the primary concerns, which are cost of living, employment, the economy, the situation in Ukraine and Russia, whilst the Police and Cabinet Office conclude their investigation.
Barbara Keeley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The police were asked to enforce COVID rules across the country, and they faced difficult challenges in doing so to keep us all safe, issuing tens of thousands of fines to people who broke the rules, even those gathering for birthdays. Does the Minister believe the Prime Minister is above the law? Because my constituents are asking why these events took place, disregarding the rules. And I say to those opposite who have attacked this business today, these matters do concern our constituents, they do.
No one is above the law in this country.
Henry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Paymaster General doesn't want to speak about the specifics of this investigation. So can I ask him, for all the dodgy coronavirus contracts, the cash for honours from the Tories, the stated intention to break international law, illegally proroguing Parliament and the many other crimes and misdemeanours of this government, does the Minister find it a tad ironic that it is the parties where they demonstrated their contempt for the public that has finally prompted the police to investigate?
Minister.
If there's anything ironic, it is the Scottish National Party.
Can I remind the Minister, it started with a joke about a fictional party during a dummy press conference, then the faux outrage from the Prime Minister, who was angry about this joke. All the while, there were parties, lots of them, and he was at some of them. There's a mountain of evidence of truth-twisting, rule-bending and law-breaking, and it lands at the feet of the man at the top. So why is this Minister still defending the indefensible?
Minister.
I see the honourable gentleman wishes to be judge, jury and executioner, but no one in this House would give him that position. What matters is justice, justice for all, and that will apply in this case as it does it in any other.
We now come to the statements. I now call the Prime Minister. Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, a few weeks ago, I commissioned an independent inquiry into a series of events in Downing Street and the Cabinet Office, as well as some other Whitehall departments that may have constituted potential breaches of the COVID regulations. That process has quite properly involved sharing information continuously with the Metropolitan Police, so I welcome the Met's decision to conduct its own investigation, because I believe this will help to give the public the clarity it needs and help to draw a line under matters. But I want to reassure the House, Mr. Speaker, and the country that I and the whole government are focused 100% on dealing with the people's priorities, including the UK's leading role in protecting freedom around the world. And with permission, I will make a statement about the United Kingdom's response to the situation in Ukraine. This winter, we've witnessed a spectacle that we hope to be banished from our continent. A large and powerful country massing troops and tanks on the border of a neighbour with the obvious threat of invading. Russia has, of course, already attacked Ukraine, illegally annexing 10,000 square miles of her territory in 2014, igniting a war in the Donbass region, and Ukraine has scarcely known a day of peace ever since. Now Ukraine faces the danger of a renewed invasion, and this time the force arrayed on Ukraine's frontier comprises over 100,000 troops, far bigger than anything Russia has deployed against her before. If the worst happens and the destructive firepower of the Russian army were to engulf Ukraine's towns and cities, I shudder to contemplate the tragedy that would ensue. Ukrainians have every moral and legal right to defend their country, and I believe their resistance would be dogged and tenacious, and the bloodshed comparable to the First War in Chechnya or Bosnia, Mr. Speaker, or any other conflict that Europe has endured since 1945. No one would gain from such a catastrophe. Russia would create a wasteland in a country which, as she continuously reminds us, is composed of fellow Slavs, and Russia would never be able to call it peace. For months, Britain has worked in lockstep with the United States and our allies across Europe to avoid such a disaster. We've sought to combine dialogue with deterrence, emphasising how a united Western alliance would exact a forbidding price for any Russian incursion into Ukraine, including by imposing heavy economic sanctions. And at the same time, we stand ready, as we always have, to address any legitimate Russian concerns through honest diplomacy. On the 13th of December, I spoke to President Putin, and I stressed that NATO had no thought of encircling or otherwise threatening his country, and that Russia enjoyed as much right as any other state to live in peace and security. But, as I said to him, Ukraine also enjoys an equal and symmetrical right to that of Russia. And I said that any attack on his neighbour would be followed by tougher sanctions against Russia, further steps to help Ukraine defend herself, and by an increased NATO presence to protect our allies on NATO's eastern flank. The truth is that Russia's goal is to keep NATO forces away from her borders. If that is Russia's goal, then invading Ukraine could scarcely be more counterproductive. My right honourable friends, the Foreign and Defence Secretaries, have both conveyed the same message to President Putin, and I'm prepared, of course, ready to speak to him again. Meanwhile, the American Deputy Secretary of State met her Russian counterpart in Geneva on the 10th of January, and the NATO-Russia Council gathered 2 days later, as the House knows. The American Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, met the Russian Foreign Minister last Friday, and the US administration has confirmed President Biden's willingness to have another meeting with President Putin, continuing the bilateral dialogue they began last year. But credible deterrence is the other side of the coin. Last night I held a virtual meeting with President Biden, President Macron, Chancellor Scholz, President Duda, Prime Minister Draghi, General Secretary Stoltenberg, President Michel, and President von der Leyen. We agreed that we would respond in unison to any Russian attack on Ukraine, in unison, by imposing coordinated and severe economic sanctions, heavier than anything we have done before against Russia. And we agreed on the necessity of finalising these measures as swiftly as possible in order to maximise their deterrent effect. We in the UK will not hesitate to toughen our national sanctions against Russia in response to whatever President Putin may do, and the House will soon hear more on this from my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary. We've already declassified compelling intelligence exposing Russian intent to install a puppet regime in Ukraine, and we will continue to disclose any Russian use of cyber attacks, false flag operations, or disinformation. Amid all these pressures, Ukraine asks for nothing except to be allowed to live in peace and to seek her own alliances, as every sovereign country has a right to do. Last week, the UK acted to strengthen Ukraine's ability to defend her soil by supplying anti-armour missiles and deploying a small training team of British personnel, in addition to the work of Operation Orbital, which, as the House will know, has trained 21,000 Ukrainian troops since 2015. Yesterday, we took the responsible precaution of temporarily withdrawing some staff and dependents from the British Embassy in Kiev, though I emphasise that the Embassy remains open and will continue to provide consular assistance for British nationals in Ukraine. And I'm particularly grateful for the dedication of our ambassador in Kiev, Melinda Simmons. I commend our NATO allies for the steps they've taken and undertaking to protect the eastern flank of the alliance. Denmark is sending a frigate to the Baltic and deploying 4 F-16s to Lithuania to join NATO's long-standing air policing mission. France has expressed its readiness to send troops to Romania under NATO command. And the United States has raised the alert level of 8,500 combat troops, preparing to deploy them in Europe at short notice. The British Army leads the NATO battle group in Estonia, and if Russia invades Ukraine, we would look to contribute to any new NATO deployments to protect our allies in Europe. In every contact with Russia, the UK and our allies have stressed our unity and our adherence to vital points of principle. We cannot bargain away the vision of a Europe whole and free that emerged in those amazing years from 1989 to 1991, healing the division of our continent by the Iron Curtain. We will not reopen that divide by agreeing to overturn the European security order because Russia has placed a gun to Ukraine's head. Nor can we accept the doctrine implicit in Russian proposals that all states are sovereign, but some are more sovereign than others. The draft treaty published by Russia in December would divide our continent once again between free nations and countries whose foreign and defence policies are explicitly constrained by the Kremlin in ways that Russia would never accept for herself. More than half of Europe, including a dozen or more members of NATO and of the European Union, would be only partially sovereign and required to seek the Kremlin's approval before inviting any military personnel from NATO countries onto their soil. The Czech Republic, at the very heart of Europe, hundreds of miles from Russia, would have to ask the Kremlin for permission if she wanted to invite a company of German infantry to join an exercise or even to help with flood defences. There is nothing new about large and powerful nations using the threat of brute force to terrify reasonable people into giving way to otherwise completely unacceptable demands. But if President Putin were to choose the path of bloodshed and destruction, he must realise that it would be both tragic and futile. And nor should we allow him to believe that he could easily take some smaller portion of Ukraine to salami slice because the resistance will be ferocious. Anyone who has been to Kiev, as I have, and stood by the Wall of Remembrance, studied the portraits of nearly 4,500 Ukrainians who've died in defence of their country since 2014. The total death toll stands in excess of 14,000. Anyone who's been there will know that the Ukrainians are determined to fight and have become steadily more skilled at guerrilla warfare. And if Russia pursues this path, many Russian mothers' sons will not be coming home. And the response in the international community would be the same, and the pain that will be inflicted on the Russian economy will be the same. When I spoke to President Putin, I also reminded him that at crucial moments in history, Britain and Russia have stood together. The only reason why both our countries are permanent members of the UN Security Council is because of the heroism of Soviet soldiers in the struggle against fascism, side by side with ourselves. I believe that all of Russia's fears could yet be allayed, and we could find a path to mutual security through patient and principled diplomacy, provided that President Putin avoids the trap of starting a terrible war, and, Mr. Speaker, a war that I believe would earn and would deserve the the condemnation of history, and I commend this statement to the House.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement. And I'm grateful to the Defence Secretary for keeping the opposition informed of developments throughout the crisis. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Britain, Russia and the United States made a solemn agreement with Ukraine. In exchange for giving up nuclear powers and weapons, Ukraine's security was to be guaranteed and its independence would be respected. Ukraine has kept its end of the deal. President Putin has not. His Russia has annexed Crimea, supported separatist conflict in Donbass, and now massed over 100,000 troops on Ukraine's borders. These are repeated and unjustifiable acts of aggression. So Labour stands resolute in our support of Ukraine's sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity. And that was made clear when our Shadow Foreign Secretary and Shadow Defence Secretary visited Kiev a fortnight ago, and I made it clear to the Ukrainian ambassador when I met him last week. This isn't just a local dispute on the other side of the continent. It's an attempt by President Putin to turn back the clock, to re-establish Russian force as a means of dominance over parts of Eastern Europe. And it's a direct threat to the anti-imperialist principle that sovereign nations are free to choose their own allies and choose their own way of life. That is why it is crucial that we in this House are united in opposing Russian aggression. So let me be clear. The Labour Party supports the steps that the government has taken to bolster Ukraine's ability to defend itself. We support international efforts to deter Russia from further aggression and the vital diplomatic efforts to de-escalate the situation. Can the Prime Minister assure the House that during talks, the UK and our partners will be resolute in our defence of Ukraine's sovereignty and the security of our NATO allies? For too long, the implicit message to Moscow has been that President Putin can do what he likes and the West will do little to respond. We must now change course and show Russia that any further aggression will result in severe real-world consequences. For Britain and our allies, that will mean taking tough decisions. That won't be easy. Widespread and hard-hitting sanctions must include cutting Russia's access to the international financial system. Europe's over-reliance on Russian energy supplies is well documented and it simply must be addressed. And in Britain, we have failed to rid our economic and political systems of the ill-gotten money used to support the Putin regime. If we take our obligations to global security seriously, we cannot go on allowing ourselves to be the world's laundromat for illicit finance. Labour has a 4-point plan. Really? First, reform Companies House to crack down on shell companies. Second, a register of overseas entities to lift the veil on who owns property and assets in the UK. Thirdly, tougher regulation on political donations. And finally, implement the recommendations of the cross-party Russia support to bolster national security. So I ask, will the Prime Minister support these measures to rid the UK of the loot of the corrupt Russian elite? We cannot stand up to Russian aggression abroad while facilitating Russian corruption at home. After the chemical attacks in Salisbury, after the annexation of Crimea, and now the threat of invasion in Ukraine, it's time to send a simple, clear and united message. We support Ukraine's sovereign right to choose her own destiny. We will stand with the Ukrainian people in the face of President Putin's threats. His aggression will come at a high price for himself and his regime. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank the right honourable gentleman, and I must say that I'm very glad that he supports the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, and he's right to ask about the assurances that this country has given to Ukraine. And I must say that I have repeatedly told Volodymyr Zelensky, as I told his predecessor Petro Poroshenko many times, we stand foursquare behind the independence and sovereignty of Ukraine, Mr. Speaker, and we always will. And we have a hard-hitting package of sanctions ready to go. What I think it would be fair to say is we want to see our European friends ready to deploy that package as soon as there should be any incursion at all by Russia into Ukraine. He asks about what we're doing to track down Russian money in this country and in this city. As he knows, we're bringing forward measures for a register of beneficial interest, Mr. Speaker, but I don't think there's any country in the world that has taken tougher action against the Putin regime. It was this government that brought in Magnitsky sanctions against all those involved in the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, Mr. Speaker, and it was this government that got the world together, got 28 countries together to protest against the poisoning that took place in Salisbury, and the world responded to that British lead, Mr. Speaker, by collectively expelling 153 diplomats around the world. And what I can tell him, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful to him for the general tenor of his intervention and for the support that he is giving to NATO, belated though it may be from the benches opposite. But I'm grateful for it. I'm grateful for it now, Mr. Speaker. And what I can tell him now, Mr. Speaker, is that that same leadership in assembling a response to Russian aggression is being shown by the UK now, and it is absolutely vital that the West, is united now, because it is our unity now that will be much more effective in deterring any Russian aggression, and that is what this government will be pursuing in the days ahead.
Tobias Elwood, the
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Prime Minister articulates, the West is now regrouping, but the penny is also dropping. The threat of sanctions will not deter this Russian aggression, and a total or even partial invasion will have severe economic and security consequences felt right across Europe and beyond. Ukraine's grain exports will be affected towards Africa. Global gas prices will be impacted and skyrocket. And where might an emboldened Russia turn to next? So I ask the government to liaise with the United States and now consider a more simpler and effective option to deter this invasion by belatedly answering Ukraine's call for help. It is not too late to mobilise a sizable NATO presence in Ukraine, utilising the superior hard power the alliance possesses to make Putin think twice about invading another European democracy.
Prime Minister.
I thank him very much, and I know that he will, emotionally, many people will share what my honourable friend says, and he knows a great deal about Ukraine and about the issues that that country faces. And of course, instinctively, many people would yearn to send active physical support in the form of NATO troops to Ukraine. I have to tell him that I don't believe that to be a likely prospect in the near term. Ukraine is not a member of NATO, but what we can do and what we are doing is sending troops to support Ukraine. I've mentioned the training operations that we're conducting under Operation Orbital, have done for the last 6 or 7 years, trained 21,000 Ukrainian troops, and of course we are now sending defensive weaponry, Mr. Speaker, defensive weaponry, which I think is entirely appropriate. 2,000 anti-tank weapons to the Ukrainians, and we join the Americans in that effort. As he knows, the Americans have sent about $650 million worth of military assistance to Ukraine. That is a vital thing to do, to stiffen Ukrainian resistance. But I think the real deterrent right now, Mr. Speaker, is that package of economic sanctions. That is what will bite, that is what will hurt Putin, and that, I hope, is what will deter him.
Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement and join with the Leader of the Opposition, and congratulating the Defence Secretary, who has made sure all through this that we've been kept informed of developments. It's most appreciated. And it is important, Mr Speaker, that all of us in this House stand together in solidarity with our friends in Ukraine in defence of their sovereignty. We on these benches share the deep concern over the escalation of tension, the prospect of military aggression and that threat to Ukraine's sovereignty. Russia's actions in recent weeks and months of amassing troops, tanks and heavy military equipment near the border of Ukraine are unacceptable. We continue to support, above all, measures to resolve the crisis through diplomacy. So will the Prime Minister provide reassurance that work to deliver a peaceful and diplomatic outcome remains this government's main priority? The threat of bloodshed on European soil is what's at stake. As we stand with the people of Ukraine and understand the fears and concerns of Ukrainians across these islands, many of them who live in the UK but have family in Ukraine, the bedrock of NATO as a defensive alliance remains the solidarity between its member states, and it is clear that we need that united alliance. It is becoming increasingly apparent that should an incursion occur, what will be required is a tougher package of sanctions that are robust and that have real measurable impact. We on these benches have called for coordinated economic sanctions against the Putin regime and the banning of Russia from the SWIFT banking system. Can this be confirmed as being on the table today? These measures must also include tougher action on Russian money laundering and include action by the Treasury to tackle the ongoing and improper use of Scottish limited partnerships, which have been used to funnel millions of pounds in dirty money. Without this, our credibility lessens. And let me say to the Prime Minister, when he raised the issue of Majinski, it was cross-party support that led to these sanctions. And he may well remember the meeting that I had with him when he was Foreign Secretary to make sure that we work collectively to deal with those threats. So, will the Prime Minister also commit to introduce a transparent system of company registration and proper reform of Companies House? Meanwhile, we all stand solidly with the people of Ukraine and urge the government to continue efforts for diplomacy as long as that is possible.
Minister. Again, Mr Speaker, I'd like to thank the right honourable gentleman to echo many of his sentiments, and he's completely right to say that we should pursue every possible diplomatic avenue in every appropriate forum, Mr Speaker, whether it's the NATO-Russia Council, the UN, the OSCE, the G7, the Normandy format. We must follow every avenue. He's right to press on what we're doing to track dirty Russian money, for want of a better expression. That's why we have the unexplained wealth orders, and that's why we're bringing in measures to have a register of beneficial interests. He asks about SWIFT and financial transactions across the world, and there is no doubt that that would be a very potent weapon. I'm afraid it can only really be deployed with the assistance of the United States, though we are in discussions about that. I think the House needs to understand that one of the big issues that we all face in dealing with Ukraine and in dealing with Russia is the heavy dependence of our European friends in particular on Russian gas. And it was clear in the conversations last night that in this era of high gas prices, we are bumping up against that reality. So the job of our diplomacy now is to persuade and encourage our friends to go as far as they can to sort this out and to come up with a tough package of economic sanctions, because that is what the situation requires.
Show the Select Committee, Tom Tugendhat for Foreign Affairs.
Mr Speaker, my right honourable friend will remember when he was Foreign Secretary, the Foreign Affairs Committee published a report entitled Moscow's Gold about dirty Russian money flowing through our system, and the call for us to have various registers of not only ownership but also foreign agents operating within our system. We've had a reminder only a week ago of why this is so important. Would he tell me what he is doing to work with partners across Europe to make sure that we stand together and do not just act as a voice outside the Kremlin, but make sure that Putin's acolytes who have profited from his kleptocratic regime act as voices inside the Kremlin, telling Putin what he is risking? Because the impressive work that the Defence Secretary has done in helping to support our Ukrainian friends could be undermined if the Kremlin doesn't listen to the very real danger that it faces today?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it is absolutely right that the best way to get attention in the Kremlin and in Moscow generally is to have sanctions that are directed at the individual, like Magnitsky sanctions, for instance. But that is what we will be coming forward with, as well as sanctions that are directed at companies, Mr. Speaker, that are of crucial strategic Russian interest.
Chris Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Kiev and Kramatorsk last week, we met politicians and community leaders who will not only be worrying for the future of their country, but will be worrying for they'll be fearful for their own lives. And I've been arguing for a very long time that the arguments that President Putin uses about Russian speakers in Ukraine are exactly the same as Adolf Hitler advanced over the Sudeten Germans in Czechoslovakia in the 1930s. I agree with the Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee that we do need to see full implementation of the Moscow Gold report. I'm sure there will be other sanctions coming. I don't quite understand why we've only sanctioned 25% of the people that the American government have already sanctioned. But this House will stand ready alongside the Prime Minister if he needs to introduce further legislation, for instance, to seize Russian assets in the UK and to make sure that the unexplained wealth orders, which have only worked in 3 cases in the last 4 years, actually have an effect. We stand ready to stand by the Ukrainian people.
Prime Minister.
I thank him very much, and I think he's completely right in what he says. His analysis of Russian, certainly of Putin's intentions towards Ukraine. I'm sure he's read the 5,000-word essay by Vladimir Putin about Ukraine and the origins of Russia. It's clear what his psychological, what his emotional, the wellsprings of his thinking are. On sanctions, I'm grateful for what he says. We're bringing forward, as he knows, a statutory instrument greatly to toughen up the package of our ability to sanction people, and I hope he will support it.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. President Putin hasn't even waited for the gas to start flowing through the Nord Stream 2 pipeline before exploiting the stranglehold that has been building on the German economy. My right honourable friend has already indicated that it may be difficult for Germany to impose severe sanctions against Russia if this invasion goes ahead. So does he not agree with me that it is vital from our security's point of view that anyone with strong Russian or communist Chinese links should be kept well away from our own critical national infrastructure?
Prime Minister.
My right honourable friend is completely right, and that's why we brought in measures to protect our national security, our national infrastructure, our critical national infrastructure, and to make sure that we are able to stop investment that we think will be detrimental to our national security, Mr. Speaker. And I'm afraid he's quite right also in what he says about the German dependence on Russian gas. We have to be respectful of this. The simple fact is that the UK, I think, of our gas supplies, about 3% comes from Russia. About 6% of German energy needs comes from Russian gas. So they are in a very different position from us. Their sacrifice is potentially very large, but we must hope that in the interests of peace, they are willing to make that sacrifice.
Ed Dave.
Can I thank the Prime Minister for his statement? It is right that we stand united across the House to support Ukraine and to stand against Russian aggression, which we should remember has already resulted in over 13,000 casualties in the last few years. The Prime Minister has rightly talked about gas being an issue in this debate, particularly on Russia, but indeed in Germany, but across Central and Eastern Europe. And it will also potentially impact this country with the threat of increased gas prices at a time when families are already facing rocketing heating bills. So could I ask him to take further action on energy, as I did during the Russian invasion of Crimea? And so, alongside all the measures he rightly proposed in his statement, will the Prime Minister convene a summit of G7 energy ministers, as we had back in 2014, to look at how we can improve short-term and medium-term energy security, protect consumers in this country and elsewhere against rocketing gas prices, and give ourselves a much stronger hand in the face of Putin's aggression?
Prime Minister.
I thank him. Also, by the way, Mr. Speaker, I think that much of the work that he did on renewables when he was in office was prescient and valuable for this country, and it's put us in a stronger position to resist the Russian gas blackmail. As I told the House just now, of our gas supplies, only 3% comes from Russia. But he's also right about the spike in prices. That's why we're working together with President Biden, with other colleagues, to see what we can do to increase the supply of gas, both to Europe and, of course, to this country as well.
Carl McCartney.
Thank you, Speaker. If Russia invades Ukraine, does my right honourable friend see the potential, as I do, that it will lead to a flood of refugees crossing from the Ukraine into the EU? So Poland, Romania and Slovakia could see massive flows of displaced people. Indeed, that may be a part of Putin's thinking. The EU is then so distracted and full of infighting, i.e. refugees, that it cannot respond militarily. What does my right honourable friend think the response from Brussels is going to be? Maybe the Poles should have a bus station at the border crossing ready to take them all to Germany and France, especially given it is Berlin and Paris that have watered down any NATO response thus far. Because if this massive flow of refugees happens, it may well be the end of the EU.
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend is making a very valuable point, because, of course, we have seen only recently how refugees from Belarus have been used as tools of political warfare, and we've got to be conscious of the potential of the Kremlin to trigger exactly the kind of refugee crisis that he describes.
Kevan Jones.
Thank you very much. Can I thank the Prime Minister for his statement and agree with him that should Putin invade Ukraine, tough sanctions will be necessary. But the Putin regime relies and exists because it floats on an ocean of illegal and illicit finance, much of it that flows through the City of London. Yeah. Now, the Prime Minister just said that the UK has the strongest laws against such illicit money. I'm sorry, Prime Minister, that's just not true. Just look at what our allies in the United States are doing. Yeah. It is now time to attack that. That is the way to actually cripple this regime. And can you tell me when he is going to implement the Russia report and its recommendations? Because as my honourable friend from Rhondda said, if that needs emergency legislation to get it through, let's do it.
Prime Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, forgive me. I want to repeat what he's right that it's vital to guard against Russian dirty monies flowing through the world, and he's completely right in his analysis of the way the kleptocracy works. That's why we have the unexplained wealth orders. That's why we're bringing forward a register of beneficial interests, and we have a new corporate offence for failure to prevent tax evasion, Madam Deputy Speaker. And we will come down, and we do come down very hard on all those who are exploiting the City of London or anywhere else to wash dirty money.
Mark Pritchard.
I welcome the Prime Minister strongly underlining Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Just back in November, Madam Deputy Speaker, there was no unanimity across Europe, increase even across the Atlantic, on the issue of Ukraine. That has changed since, over the last few months, with the good offices of the Prime Minister's Office, Defence Secretary and Foreign Secretary. He mentions his conversation last night with Chancellor Olaf Scholz. The Germans are a critical part of all of this, both on diplomacy and defence. They are a key international partner and ally. We can do it with the Americans, we can do it with others, but it will be far more effective if we do it with the Germans.
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend is completely right, and I just want to say a word or two in praise of Olaf Scholz, because last night in conversation with him, it was clear, as I've said to the House, how difficult this is for Germany. Nobody should be any doubt about that. But it was also clear that the new German Chancellor is determined to stand with the rest of the West, to have a united front, and amongst other things, of course, Germany has made it clear that Nord Stream 2 cannot they can't take part in Nord Stream 2 if there's a Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Ben Bradshaw.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister was absolutely right to say that Western unity is key. So could he explain why the UK began withdrawing some of our diplomats from Kiev this week, unlike most of the rest of NATO?
Prime Minister.
I thank him. We're actually in lockstep with the United States, and as he knows, we've kept at least 30 of our diplomats there, including Melinda Simmons, our outstanding ambassador. The UK presence continues to be very strong in Kiev, but those are sensible precautionary steps.
Sir Ian Duncan-Smith.
Mr. Speaker, can I say to my honourable friend, first of all, I congratulate him and the Defence Secretary, the Foreign Secretary, for a very robust set of leadership with NATO and our European allies and with the United States. But does he not also agree that right now we are facing an even wider threat? Whilst it's Ukraine today, the powers of dictatorship have watched as we did nothing over Georgia, over Crimea, South Ossetia, and they've been encouraged. Even now, China is looking at Taiwan, watching what our reaction will be. Does he not agree now that we have to get our allies to recognise we must never put ourselves in the position when it comes to energy, such that we are dependent on these terrible regimes for our future? We need to get security in our energy now.
Prime Minister.
My right honourable friend is completely right in what he says about the need for us to guarantee the independence of our energy. That's why it's so vital that we're building our wind power and other renewables so fast, Madam Deputy Speaker. But he's also right in his analysis of what is happening. What Putin basically wants is to go back to the Yalta system of spheres of influence. And it's not just Ukraine, Madam Deputy Speaker, that he has his eye on. And therefore, this moment now matters for the whole geometry and security architecture of Europe, and we must stand firm.
Order. Short and concise questions, please, because I will be finishing this statement at 2:20. Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. The military reality is that President Putin knows that if he invades, he will not be facing NATO troops, and therefore the sanctions we put in place have to be the strongest possible. Is the Prime Minister not concerned that, given the answer he just gave about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, the fact discussions are still continuing about exclusion from the SWIFT system, that we're not demonstrating determined, united resolve at the very moment where we need the credible threat of strong sanctions to try and deter him from invading Ukraine?
Prime Minister.
I thank him. I think his point is very important. Actually, I think that we are making a huge amount of progress. And I want to thank my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, the Defence Secretary, for the work that they're doing, because I think we are bringing together the West on a very tough package, and that's what we need.
Bob Stewart.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I remind the House we do actually guarantee the sovereignty of Ukraine by having signed the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, along with the United States and Russia, and I think later France and even China. But could I ask my right honourable friend if he agrees with me that if we really economically and financially strangle Russia with sanctions, Russia could well become bankrupt, and this alone might be something to cause Mr. Putin to blink before he gives agreement to using military power and turning it into military force?
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend is completely right that we have the potential to do very serious economic damage to Russia. What we have to make sure, as everybody said on the call last night, is that we don't inflict damage on the Western economies, just as people are suffering in particular from high gas prices, and that's what we've got to do. Don't forget, he's quite right, 41% of Russia's GDP comes from oil and gas.
Alison Toulis.
Speaker, the truth about unexplained wealth orders is that only a handful of them have been issued, and the Registration of Overseas Entities Bill has now been waiting for 4 years for action. So when the Finance Bill returns to this House, will the Government bring forward measures to tighten up on the flow of dirty Russian money in the UK? Or is the truth really that he's perfectly content with this because so much of it appears to end up in Tory party coffers?
Prime Minister.
No, Madam Deputy Speaker, we do not accept foreign donations, as she knows very well. And what we will do is bring forward targeted targeted sanctions, which I think are the most effective way of doing it, targeting the sanctions at the personalities that surround President Putin and making them understand the price that they will pay.
Dr. Andrew Morrison.
Madam Deputy Speaker, there's no public appetite for using UK combat troops in Ukraine, absolutely none. But we do have other tools in our toolbox. Is the Prime Minister contemplating using the full spectrum approach to cyber, including offensive cyber, that he talked about in March in connection with the integrated review?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Madam Deputy Speaker, the NCSC, the National Security Cybersecurity Centre, is indeed offering help to Ukraine for precisely that purpose. Russian cyber attacks, as the House knows, can be extremely damaging, and we can do a lot to help.
Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The government's position is that sanctions will be deployed against Russia if there is an incursion. But would the government consider deploying some sanctions now as a clear signal to Russia and to say if President Putin stands down his troops and withdraws his forces, then further sanctions will not be deployed? Would that not be a more effective sequencing of the process?
I thank him for his thoughtful argument. We already have, as I've said, Madam Deputy Speaker, we already have Magnitsky sanctions, various sanctions already in place on the Russian regime, sanctions in response to the seizure of Crimea and Sevastopol, already in place, a wide variety of sanctions. I think what we need to do, if I may say so, is build up that instant automatic package of sanctions, of Western sanctions, that will come in automatically in the event of a single toe cap of a Russian incursion into more of Ukraine.
Jackie Doyle-Price.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome the robust sentiment behind my right honourable friend's statement. And indeed, it's important that the unity across this House is expressed in opposition to Putin if we are going to make a reality of that. But my right honourable friend mentioned in his opening remarks Bosnia, and he will be aware of the sabre rattling happening in Republika Srpska, encouraged by Russia. He will also be aware that there is still occupied territory in Moldova. And could he reassure me that these areas are also under discussion with the Allies?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend makes an excellent, Madam Deputy Speaker, I say, makes an excellent point. And this crisis around Ukraine is one that will be replayed across the whole map of Eastern Europe. Madam Deputy Speaker, if we fail now and if we don't stand up to Putin. She's entirely right about what she says about the Balkans.
Jamie Stone.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Not just Ukraine. We have military forces in Estonia. Estonia is a member of NATO and a true friend of the UK. The Prime Minister said that if Russia invades Ukraine, we will then bolster up our NATO allies. Should we not have more forces in Estonia now?
A very good point, Madam Deputy Speaker. I've been to see the 850 troops in Tapa, as I'm sure he has as well. They do a fantastic job in Estonia. What we're looking to do is potentially to increase our presence in the NATO southeastern flank as well.
Bernard Jenkin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for his statement, which puts the United Kingdom at the forefront of the response to President Putin's monstrous military intimidation. Yes. And can he personally pledge himself to the defence of the new democracies of Eastern Europe who suffered under the Soviet yoke for so long and still want to be free? And will he acknowledge that this cannot be a change just if the invasion takes place? The change must happen anyway. We must make sure that we are prepared in a new Cold War against this kind of intimidation until the Russian regime is removed.
Prime Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend, and I know that he speaks for many friends and many good allies in Eastern Europe, in Poland, in the Czech Republic, in the Baltic states. There are people who would precisely echo his sentiments, and that's why we have to stand strong and united today for Ukraine.
Neil Coyle.
The Prime Minister describes Ukraine and Russia as equal parties, and
we know he likes a party. But he also said, Ukraine scarcely known a day of peace since the 2014 Russian invasion and illegal annexation. Indeed, in December, there were 128 shellings of Ukrainians in Donetsk, and 3 Ukrainian soldiers have been murdered by Russian-backed forces since January. So the question is, why has he not acted sooner? And why is he even now saying we must wait for full-scale invasion before further sanctions, including access to SWIFT, and implementing the Moscow Golden Russian Report recommendations takes place? Why wait?
Prime Minister.
I'm afraid that I think the Honourable must have missed what I already said. We already have a very wide package of sanctions in place since the Russian incursion of 2014. We have sanctions, personal sanctions and other sanctions for what they did in Crimea and Sevastopol, and what we're going to do now is ratchet those sanctions up very, very considerably. And I'm afraid he's not right in what he says about leaving Ukraine alone or abandoning Ukraine since 2014. Operation Orbital, the UK has been out there in the front helping to train Ukrainian troops, 21,000 of them since 2015, Madam Deputy Speaker.
James Sunderland.
Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you. The Prime Minister will know, of course, that Ukraine is not a full member of NATO. But could I please ask him to comment on the feasibility of direct military action by NATO, notwithstanding that Article 5 does not apply?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him very much, and I want really to go back to the answer I gave to the right honourable gentleman for Bournemouth. I know that many people emotionally will want to commit NATO troops to the defence of Ukraine. We have UK troops there now. Members of the Ranger Regiment are going to supplement those we already have. But I have to say that there is no member of NATO that is currently willing to deploy in Ukraine in large numbers to fight Russian aggression in the way that he suggests. The best thing, and indeed we have to beware of doing things, Madam Deputy Speaker, that would constitute a pretext for Putin to invade. We have to calculate and calibrate what we do very carefully. And I think building a strong package of economic sanctions, continuing to supply defensive weaponry, and all the other things that we're doing, that's the right package.
Stuart Hosey.
Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister said we have already declassified compelling intelligence exposing Russian intent, and he said we will continue to disclose any Russian use of false flag operations or disinformation. How much of that declassified information will be made fully public so as to blunt or halt the spread of Russian disinformation by letting people who see it know that it's false before they decide to press the share or send button?
Minister.
Well, he makes an excellent point, of course, because it's very, very important that people in Ukraine and around the world should be able to trust the information that we're giving out. I've no doubt that the intelligence that we shared about the coup attempt in Kiev was right, or the people who are conspiring against the regime was right. But we will divulge as much of our sourcing as we can without compromising our intelligence sources.
Alan Cairns.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We are all naturally alarmed and share concerns at the risks that people of Ukraine face, but take confidence from the Prime Minister's statement and actions in helping coordinate the Western response. But does my right honourable friend agree with me that NATO must always leave the door open for Ukraine joining?
Yes.
Prime Minister.
My right honourable friend is completely right, and he puts his finger on the fundamental point and the thing that we cannot bargain away. A sovereign country must have the right to choose her own destiny, choose its own destiny. That's what Ukraine must have. Of course, the path to NATO membership will not be easy for anybody, and it's not. No one is saying that is going to happen immediately. But a country must be allowed to choose its own way forward, and that's what we're sticking up for.
Stephen Farrell.
Thank you very much. Any Russian invasion of Ukraine would be a very serious breach of the terms of the United Nations Charter. In 2014, the seizure of Crimea was discussed in the Security Council, I think, on 7 occasions, and eventually a resolution was passed through the General Assembly, which left Russia extremely isolated. So what plans does the government have to pursue this current crisis through the UN, and given the reality of a Russian veto on the Security Council, to perhaps look once again to the General Assembly?
Prime Minister.
I think the honourable gentleman is completely right, and I think that it is an underestimated point in our favour that I don't believe in the end that Russia wants the kind of isolation that would ensue. I think Russia does, of the global institutions, Russia takes the UN very seriously. Russia values her membership of the UN Security Council, and I think what he proposes about using the General Assembly is entirely right. But it's very important that we not only have tough measures, but we also provide the avenue for diplomacy as well.
Jane Stevenson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to thank the Prime Minister for sending such a strong and clear message to Vladimir Putin and for everyone across this House in backing the Prime Minister on such a crucial issue. At such a worrying time, can the Prime Minister reassure British nationals in Ukraine that our embassy in Kiev remains open to provide assistance should they require it?
Prime Minister.
Yes, and I'm very happy to give that reassurance. As I've said just now, the embassy continues to function. At least 30 staff are there to look after British interests in Kiev and around Ukraine.
Luke Pollard.
Mr. Speaker, the Kremlin does not act in isolation, it acts against the plan. So can the Prime Minister set out what additional support we'll be providing to our allies on NATO's eastern flank, especially using UK forces that are already stationed in those countries to deter any future Russian aggression after any invasion of Ukraine?
Prime Minister.
Thank you. Well, he's making a very important point that what we all are discussing at the moment is what we can do to fortify NATO's southeastern flank. The French are looking at Romania. There are questions about Hungary and what we might do there, which of course there are complex issues, as he knows, involving the Hungarian minority in Ukraine. Everybody can see the need now to move NATO forces, particularly the Americans. You heard what I said about the 8,500 troops are getting ready to go to Europe. Everybody can see the need to fortify NATO's eastern flank.
Richard Drax.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The diplomacy of the velvet glove must be supported by a steel fist if it's to be effective. Does this threat to NATO indirectly inform the Prime Minister that perhaps NATO must spend more money on its conventional forces, and in that regard would he reconsider the cut to our army of 10,000?
Madam Deputy Speaker, we have spent record sums on our wonderful army, and it is more agile, more lethal, more deployable around the world. That's why we're able to move at speed, to deploy not just in Estonia, but as I was saying to the gentleman opposite, we will look to move to other parts of NATO's eastern frontier as well.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister, the MOD and FCDO Secretary of State for their resolute and strong stance. UK, NATO and USA have committed troops to the Balkan states, to Poland, and to combat and stop Russian aggression, similar support needs to be given to the Ukraine. In the pictures last week in the press, it showed the Ukraine militia training with wooden guns. Can I ask, and very much illustrates the David and Goliath struggle, can the Prime Minister confirm that military assistance and boots on the ground are what is needed urgently and right now in the Ukraine? Thank you.
Yes, I saw those pictures too of Ukrainians training, Ukrainian civilians training with wooden weapons, and I can tell him that we are supporting the Ukrainian army, and there is a strong tradition now in Ukraine of militias, of people who understand how to fight a guerrilla war. And I think the message we need to get across to the Russian people is that this would be a disaster for them and a political disaster for Vladimir Putin.
Jonathan Ginocchia.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In his very strong statement, my right honourable friend quite rightly spoke about the need for Western unity. So of all countries in Europe, it does seem bizarre that Germany needs to be reminded that murderous dictators will never be satisfied with a single land grab, and that any attack on Ukraine is an attack ultimately on all of Europe. Will my right honourable friend be reminding the Germans of this?
Prime Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend, and he and I have discussed these types of issues over many years. Actually, I think that given the extreme delicacy of the matter in Germany, given the dependence that I've described to the House on Russian hydrocarbons. Actually, I really think that Olaf Scholz is doing a huge job of moving and getting us to a position where we have a united Western approach, and that I commend the German government.
Malcolm MacDonald.
I'm grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker. For reasons we don't need to go over just now, Germany has blocked some NATO allies from providing certain military assistance to Ukraine. What assessment has the government made of that blocking, and where it is necessary for Ukraine to defend itself, will the UK government, along with others, ensure that it gets the maximum spread of capability that we're able to provide it with?
Prime Minister.
Well, he makes a very important point, of course, but as he knows, and as I've told the House, the NLAWs that we've sent, in addition to all the aid we've given under Operation Orbital, were the second biggest contributor to the defence of, and I stress the defence of Ukraine. And I think I saw a poll of the Ukrainian people which said that the UK was now the most popular government in Ukraine, the foreign government, not second only to the Scottish government, but second only to Lithuania, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Robert Chenry.
The UK has proven to be the preeminent European nation in supporting and defending the Ukraine, and so I thank my right honourable friend for his leadership on that. Nobody could doubt our commitment to European security, and I've been encouraged by the remarks he's already made with respect to Germany, but it is critical that the German government play a full part if we're going to deliver the unprecedented package of financial and other sanctions that he's described and was set out in the call last night. How confident is he of that, and what more can he do with Chancellor Schulz to ensure that's delivered?
Prime Minister.
He's right. Germany is absolutely critical for our success in this. We've just got to keep the pressure up together.
Leila Moran.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I heard what the Prime Minister said earlier about introducing a register for beneficial interests, but my question to him is when? Because it's been 6 years that it was promised at that dispatch box. He said it to the Leader of the Opposition. 6 years since it was promised. Nothing has happened. Every moment we wait undermines our position. I've laid the bill. It's got support from both sides. Please, will he take it up? We need to send the message that cronies' money is not welcome in this country.
She's completely right. In addition to the unexplained wealth orders and the crackdown on tax evasion, we do want to register a beneficial interest. And I can tell her that my right honourable friend, the Leader of the House, tells me we will do it as soon as parliamentary time allows.
Jason McCartney.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I have a vibrant Ukrainian community in my Colne Valley constituency. I met with many of them earlier this month. Will the Prime Minister please reassure my constituents of our commitment to the defence support package for Ukraine, our readiness to unleash economic sanctions on Russia, and also stand firm for freedom and democracy alongside the Ukrainian people?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Madam Deputy Speaker, and the UK has been at this for a long time now, and I think it was an important signal that I hope he will take back to his constituents that we stuck up for Ukrainian rights of navigation when we sent HMS Defender. Through that route, if you remember, the government came under some pressure from people for taking what was described as a provocative route. All we were doing, Madam Deputy Speaker, was sticking up for the rights of freedom of navigation for the Ukrainians.
Alan Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Russian regime is a clear and present danger to the rules-based international order, so the SNP will be part of the coalition in Ukraine's defence. But in that spirit, would the Prime Minister accept the real frustration on this side of the House that his own credibility, the credibility of his own government and all of us, has been undermined by continued inaction in implementing the Moscow's Gold Report and the Russia Report? We would support the legislation to strengthen his own credibility. Let's get on with it.
Prime Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I don't think that's fair. The government has been absolutely ruthless in implying Magnitsky sanctions, which his right honourable friend helped to promote. It was my right honourable friend, the Lord Chancellor, who produced them. They're a great thing. We've targeted people involved in the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, and we will use direct targeted sanctions now against the Putin regime.
Felicity Beckham.
Speaker,
Ukraine has very strong historical and cultural links to my constituency of Kensington, with the Ukrainian Embassy, the Cultural Centre and the Ukrainian Institute, all based in Holland Park. Can my right honourable friend assure me that we will do everything to support the people of Ukraine in their desire to live in peace?
Prime Minister.
Yes, indeed, Madam. I'm familiar with the statue of, I think, St. Volodymyr in her constituency, and I know the amazing contribution of the Ukrainian community to our great capital, and I hope she will pass the message that we stand foursquare with them.
Madam Kaiser.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. A percentage of our natural gas comes from Russia, and Putin has already said that he'll turn off the taps if he deems Moscow to have been unfairly sanctioned by the West. My constituents of Airdrie and Shotts are already struggling with rising fuel costs, and that's why I voted in the SNP increasing cost of living debate yesterday. Does the Prime Minister accept that he must bring in a package of policies to help families pay for bills on the domestic front so that this international issue does not compound the problem?
Prime Minister.
Well, Madam Deputy, she's quite right to draw attention to the price spike in energy around the world. Actually, Russian gas only comprises 3% of the UK's gas supplies, but what we've got to do is mitigate the impacts on families of the costs of energy with all the cold weather payments, everything that we're doing to increase the living wage, all the support that we're giving families throughout the winter and beyond.
Sheriff Farah.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and may I commend my right honourable friend on his tough statement. The point has already been made about the disinformation that is coming from the Kremlin, but my right honourable friend will appreciate that a lot of that is targeted towards NATO itself. Would he use this opportunity to make it absolutely clear that NATO is a defensive organisation and that it should not in any way be construed as being offensive or threatening?
Yes, I thank my right honourable friend, and he is so right, because that is the misconception, whether it is witting or otherwise. Russia persists in the fiction that NATO is somehow an aggressive alliance and a threat to Russia. NATO is not an aggressive alliance. Russia is not encircled by threats, and it is absolutely vital that we convey that to Vladimir Putin. And I think if he can understand that, that is the route to progress, and that is the diplomatic path that we've got to follow.
Dr. Hughes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister will get every support for defending national self-determination from these benches within Europe. But does he not agree it's now time that the UK Government sign a robust security and defence agreement with the European Union to replace that signed in the Lisbon Treaty, critically, Article 42.7?
Prime Minister.
I thank him. Actually, if you look at what's happening, the conversation that I had last night with European partners comprised the vast bulk of defence spending in the West, and we work very closely with our European partners, as we do with all our NATO partners, and NATO remains the primary vehicle for our defence, and NATO is a very valuable interlocutor with Russia, and the NATO-Russia Council has proved its worth in the last few months.
Philip Hollowbone.
This is the wake-up call that NATO needs, so that all its members finally meet their obligations to spend at least 2% of their GDP on defence.
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend is completely right, because I think, as so many colleagues have said, this is not just about Ukraine. This is about the ambition of the Kremlin to seize this moment to try to reimpose a new order, a new security architecture in the European continent, one that we absolutely reject, Madam Deputy. We stand for the rights of free peoples everywhere to determine their own fate. That was the fantastic achievement of the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, that high moment in 1990 when we had a Europe whole and free. That's what we're trying to protect.
Last question, Margaret Ferrier.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There are reports of some Ukrainians beginning to stock up in non-perishable goods. Can the Prime Minister confirm that the Government has plans in place to support provision of necessities to ordinary Ukrainian people if necessary?
Of course, we will do what we can to provide economic support in the event of a disaster, but the most important thing we can do now is try to prevent that disaster from occurring. That is by unifying the West in the way that I've been describing this afternoon.
Order. I thank the Prime Minister for his statement. I'm sorry not everybody could get in, but we do have to move on to the next business. Order, Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Since the Paymaster General responded to the urgent question, it has been reported that the Metropolitan Police actually want the full Grey report to be published and are surprised at the Government's position. Now, given what the Paymaster General told the House about the Government cooperating with the police, if this is confirmed, then we would expect them to do so. But can you give us guidance, Madam Deputy Speaker, about what the House can do to enforce that if they do not?
Well, I thank the right honourable gentleman for his point of order. This is not really a matter for the Chair, it's a matter for the Government. I'm sure that he will be able to seek advice from the Table Office and others as to whether there are other avenues that can be pursued in terms of eliciting the information he is looking for. But I also know that the front bench will have heard his point of order and his concerns, and I'm sure they will report that back. Thank you. We now move on to the 10-minute rule motion. Hugh Merriman.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to make provision to protect consumers from being charged twice for the same good or service and for connected purposes. In a nutshell, this bill seeks to end the practice where customers are fined or charged again for a transaction which they can prove has already been purchased. I'm seeking to introduce this bill, having supported constituents who have attempted, unsuccessfully, to appeal against these charges. I am left with the view that the law needs to change to give consumers more rights and to catch up with changes in technology which those who charge do not appear to have embraced. In this regard, I am grateful to the campaign group Which for their support in bringing about this change. Let me give a few examples of those who would be helped if we could put this bill onto the statute book. Firstly, the driver who parks their car in a local authority car park and puts their annual season ticket on the dashboard. They close the door and the ticket slips down and is not displayed correctly. Despite being able to prove that they have a season ticket registered to their car, they have not displayed the pass, and it is this which delivers them a £60 fine. Secondly, the rail passenger who prints out their train line documentation, but the ticket barrier cannot read a QR code. Despite the documentation demonstrating proof of payment, it is technically not a ticket, and they get charged a penalty fare at the barrier, despite the fact that the ticket machine, which could print the ticket, is 10 metres the other side of that barrier. These are examples from my constituency, real-life examples, which have supplied others. A driver issued a parking penalty notice by a local authority because he accidentally used the wrong parking area code on a map, despite him paying the right amount to the right council, but for the wrong part of the car park. A driver issued a parking penalty in similar circumstances where the driver had paid the parking company by phone, but previously registered with a car now replaced. A woman who knocked 2 parking tickets off her dashboard and accidentally placed the incorrect ticket for display. This woman owns the space in question under her lease and has evidence of the valid ticket confirming no loss suffered by the parking company. And fourthly, a man who received a parking penalty notice after he filled in the wrong entry time for a supermarket car park but paid for the length of his stay. No loss was suffered by the supermarket, who could have confirmed the same by looking at the cameras. These are numerous and additional examples of this sharp practice, where consumers have been fined despite no loss being suffered by the organisation. It is the case that some organisations offer discretion, but some do not. Many cases occur because the organisation is using outmoded technology. Why is it that local authorities fine drivers for not displaying a ticket when an easier and hassle-free alternative is for a parking attendant to be given the technology to check the vehicle registration against the season ticket database? In our digital age, consumers are being offered efficient ways to purchase, and these are not always being matched by an efficient way to prove purchase. This bill would seek to ensure organisations catch up with this century's technology. Let's take the train line case as an example. My constituent took the train from Brighton to Tunbridge Wells, which necessitated a change at London Bridge. The barrier at Brighton recognised the QR code, so no printed orange rail ticket was needed. The leg from London Bridge to the leg from London Bridge to Tunbridge Wells did need an orange rail ticket because the barrier at Tunbridge Wells had not been upgraded. However, the constituent did not need to leave the platform at London Bridge. Despite showing paperwork confirming name, payment and train times, the constituent got a penalty fare from the operative manning the barrier. He could have walked 10 metres with her to the ticket machine and obtained the ticket there and then. Instead, he explained the constituent would be able to appeal the penalty fare. This did not succeed, and neither did an appeal to the fares regulator. In none of these circumstances and none of these examples did the service provider suffer any loss. Instead, they have ended up making a profit off the back of those customers who have already paid. It's an absolute rip-off and an obvious black hole of consumer legislation which needs a fix. This is what my bill would seek to do. While the cases I have highlighted are transport-related, this is a general consumer issue, and I hope the Bayes Minister on the government benches will lend his full support. That said, I am grateful for the support of the Transport Select Committee members who are supporting this bill. I should highlight that it is important that those this bill seeks to protect can demonstrate purchase. We cannot aid those who seek to commit fraud. With the support of government, this could be overcome. Madam Deputy Speaker, the last time I attempted to introduce a bill in these circumstances, which was to make it a requirement for banks to ensure every high street supporting 5,000 or more residents had at least one free 24/7 ATM cash point, and the government backed that move. From the time before, when I attempted to bring in automatic and automotive passenger refunds, we have had partial moves in that right direction from the government. I am grateful to them and colleagues across the House who have supported the introduction of this legislation. More, I'm afraid, than the 11 signatures allow me to put, but I'm very grateful here to see the honourable members for Southport and New Forest East here supporting this bill. Because we all have constituents who have suffered at the hands of pernicious organisations who are living in the last century. I very much hope that the government will find a way to support an end to this sharp practice.
The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. The contrary no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
Madam Deputy Speaker, Graham Morris, Carl McCartney, Gavin Newlands, Jim Shannon, Ben Bradshaw, Greg Smith, Robert Largan, Simon Jupp, Sally Ann Hart, Steve Brine, Robbie Moore and myself, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Hugh Merriman.
Consumer Protection Double Charging Bill.
Second reading what day?
Sorry, Friday the 18th of March 2022.
Friday the 18th of March 2022. Thank you. Thank you. Point of order, Asfal Khan.
Thank you. On a point of order, Madam Deputy Speaker, the shocking and serious allegation made by the member of Wealdon reminds us that the Conservative government continues to ignore the blatant Islamophobia in its own ranks. I wrote to the Prime Minister urging him to better safeguard the British Muslims and to fulfil his promise to carry out an independent investigation into the Conservative Party. Madam Deputy Speaker, it took him over a year to respond. I was then promised a full response from the Secretary of State for Levelling Up. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's been 2 months and I still haven't received this. I understand the government have been busy with parties, with meetings, But is it in order for the Minister to continue to ignore the correspondence on such a serious matter as Islamophobia?
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving notice of his point of order. Ministers should reply to correspondence in a timely manner, and I do hope that the honourable gentleman receives a full reply to his correspondence quickly. I also know that ministers on the government front bench will have heard his point of order and my response to it, and I trust they will take steps to make sure that a reply is sent soon. Thank you. We now move on to the programme motion. Minister to move. I beg to move. The question is the Judicial Review and Courts Bill programme number 2 motion as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Judicial Review and Courts Bill as amended in Public Bill Committee to be considered.
Now. Thank you. We begin with new clause 1, with which it will be convenient to consider the other selected new clauses and amendments as listed on the selection paper. New clause 4. Sorry, did I say new clause 1? New clause 4. I do beg your pardon. Before I call the Shadow Minister to move new clause 4, I would be grateful if when he stands there could be an indication by others standing of whether they wish to participate in these first group of amendments. Thank you. I call Shadow Minister Andy Slaughter to move new clause 4.
I beg to move that new clause 4 be read a second time. And thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to open this debate and to speak to the new clauses and amendments standing in my name and that of my honourable and right honourable friends. I'm grateful to the Government for their cooperation on the programme motion and to the Minister and his colleagues for the civilised way which we've argued the bill thus far. Unfortunately, they have not been persuaded by our arguments in committee, and so if there's no movement today, we will be voting against the bill on third reading as we did at second. We have issues with part 2 of the bill which will mainly be dealt with by my honourable friend for Stockton North in the second debate this afternoon, though I will deal in this group of amendments with our concerns on Chapter 4 on coroners and our proposed new clauses 4 to 6. But I will start with the amendments relating to Part 1 of the bill, which are the most numerous and which we find most needed to try and redeem this bill. There is a strong clue to our approach in that we have tabled Amendment 23 to leave out in its entirety Clause 1 of the bill, and I have signed Amendment 5, tabled by the Liberal Democrat spokesperson, to leave out Clause 2. In short, we see no merit at all in Part 1 of the bill and would strike it out. The purpose of judicial review is to determine whether public bodies have made lawful decisions and to provide remedies where they do not. The conceit of the government's approach, taken further in new clauses 8 and 9, tabled by the Right Honourable Member for South Holland and the Deepings, is that the courts are trespassing on the rights of Parliament, are substituting their own views for ours, and in some ways entering the realm of politics. We read that the Justice Secretary and the Prime Minister think the bill which was introduced by the previous Lord Chancellor, the Right Honourable Member for South Swindon, does not go far enough in clipping the judges' wings. They seek to remedy this through repeal of the Human Rights Act and its replacement by a so-called new Bill of Rights, and by an Interpretation Act, an annual audit by Parliament of which judicial decisions they like and which they seek to overturn. We say this is constitutionally wrong and a provocation. A better way to look at this role of the courts was set out by the late Lord Bingham in the case of and the Secretary of State. Rejecting submissions from the then Attorney General in that case, Lord Bingham said, "I do not in particular accept the distinction which he drew between democratic institutions and the courts. It is of course true that the judges in this country are not elected and are not answerable to Parliament. It is also, of course, true that Parliament, the Executive and the courts have different functions, but the function of independent judges charged to interpret and apply the law is universally regarded as a cardinal feature of the modern democratic state, a cornerstone of the rule of law itself. The Attorney-General is fully entitled to insist on the proper limits of judicial authority, but he is wrong to stigmatise judicial decision-making as in some way undemocratic. We celebrate the role that judicial review plays in our Constitution. In the words of our Amendment 30, judicial review is of fundamental constitutional importance to the rule of law, the accountability of public bodies and the government in particular, access to justice and the protection of human rights, and that limitation on access to judicial review should only be imposed where strictly necessary and proportionate. Should the government prefer that wording to the existing Clause 1, that would be welcome. Failing that, we've tabled 11 further amendments which cumulatively or in the alternative seek to mitigate the worst effects of Clause 1. Clause 1 introduces suspended or prospective-only quashing orders and cements them with a presumption that these will be employed by the courts in most cases. The government-appointed independent review of administrative law, which was supposed to lay the groundwork for this legislation, did not recommend prospective-only orders and specifically disapproved any presumption as to their use. Prospective-only orders could deprive claimants of a proper chance of redress and would certainly create a chilling effect. What is the incentive in pursuing judicial review if the claimant themselves has no prospect of having the wrong righted? The presumption is the clearest, but not the only way Clause 1 seeks to fetter judicial discretion. Our remaining amendments seek to restore that discretion and to attack the most prescriptive parts of the clause. Amendment 24 provides that modified quashing orders will only be applied where, in the court's view, it is in the interests of justice and ought to be confined to those rare cases where a quashing order might cause, for example, significant disadvantage to third parties. Amendment 31 recognises that suspended quashing orders may be beneficial in some cases, but seeks clarity from the government on their intentions and what conditions they feel should be met when using this provision. Amendment 26 looks to preserve collateral challenge in the event that these modified quashing orders are used. Say, for example, delegated legislation during the coronavirus crisis, which created imprisonable criminal offences, was declared illegal by a court. If a court granted a prospective-only quashing order under the bill, it would make imprisonment legal before the remedy. A person accused could not argue before the criminal courts that the statutory instrument was invalid, because this subsection of the bill requires a judge to act as if it were valid. Amendment 26 seeks to protect a person's right to use the court's decision as a defence in criminal proceedings. Amendment 27, Madam Deputy Speaker, clarifies that any factors which the court considers are a matter for its own judgment, The current use of must instead of may directs the judge's reasoning and interferes with judicial independence and discretion. This is especially obnoxious as judicial review is discretionary and involves taking account of all the factors before the court. A court must be able to do justice on the facts, not be nudged to decide cases favourably to the executive. Amendments 33, 34, 35, 28 and 32 deal with the list of factors the bill requires the courts to consider when applying a quashing order. For example, Amendment 33 will remove a factor which would unfairly disadvantage the claimant. Amendment 34 recognises that a suspended or prospective-only quashing order can leave a claimant waiting for justice, and so this amendment asks the court to be mindful of a timely remedy. And Amendment 28 would remove the requirement to take account of actions which the public body proposes to take. For example, if a public body tells a court that they intend to carry out certain measures to fix a problem, a court may suspend the quashing order. But if the public body goes away and changes its mind on the actions it will take, the claimant again is left without a timely remedy. Amendment 28 will ensure that the court does not have to take account of the proposals made by a public body, and so a quicker remedy for the claimant ensues. Taking together, these amendments rebalance the proposal in Clause 1 in order to protect the rights of claimants. Amendment 29 clarifies that the principle of good administration includes the need for administration to be lawful. And let me finally, in addressing Clause 1, turn to Amendment 25. This amendment will remove the presumption that suspended or prospective-only quashing orders should be used, and instead favours an effective remedy being offered to the claimant so that justice is preserved. The presumption sets out in Clause 1, Subclause 9 of the Bill, undermines the independence and discretion of the court. The presumption acts on a one-size-fits-all approach to justice and does not respect the judge's ability to assess the facts laid out in front of them in their courtroom and decide on a suitable conclusion. Amendment 25 also has a further protective factor that if Clause 1 is kept within the bill and suspended and prospective-only quashing orders are to be used, there will be a precondition that there will be an effective remedy. If there is a single step which would improve this part of the bill, save for abandoning it entirely, it is the removal of the presumption. For that reason, we would wish to test the House on Amendment 25 this afternoon and put it to the vote at the end of this debate. Turning to Clause 2, Clause 2 ousts the jurisdiction of the High Court in relation to what are called carte judicial reviews and removes the supervisory jurisdiction of the court over the tribunal system in those cases. For example, where the upper tribunal has refused the claimant the right to challenge a decision made in the first-tier tribunal not to allow an appeal of their earlier decision. In committee, we objected to Clause 2, both because of the nature of the cases subject to the carte jurisdiction, which are primarily but not exclusively immigration and asylum cases, but also because on the government's own admission, it is designed to set a precedent for future employment of ouster clauses, which it clearly intends to become a more common feature of legislation, another attempt to subvert the authority of the courts. Unlike with Clause 1, there is little that could be done to improve Clause 2. You either like it or you don't, and therefore most commentators who are concerned by it think the only solution is to strike it down. That was also the view of both opposition parties in committee, and we see from Amendment 5 that it is also the view of the Liberal Democrats, whose amendment to leave out Clause 2 I have signed. Contrary to the government's narrative that carte judicial reviews are profligate, they are only allowed to proceed where there is an arguable case which has a reasonable prospect of success, that both the decision of the upper tribunal refusing permission to appeal and the decision of the first-tier tribunal against which permission to appeal was sought are wrong in law, and the claim either raises an important point of principle or practice, or there is some other compelling reason to hear it. So again, this is a mechanism to right a wrong. In the instance of carte judicial review, it is to be used when there has been a serious error of law in the first-tier tribunal and stops deserving cases slipping through the net. Carte judicial review is usually used for asylum or human rights cases. As all members will know from their casework, such claims are not only complex, but have serious consequences for the claimants and are often matters of life and death. The independent review of administrative law did favour doing away with carte JRs, but these recommendations are based on the wrong statistics of very low success rates, 0.22%. The government now admits that success rates could be 15 times higher, at 3.4%, although other analyses estimate 5% or even above 7%. In committee, I cited many compelling cases, which I do not have time to repeat here. We are concerned at the consequences for individuals currently protected by the right of appeal, albeit in narrow and prescribed circumstances. But we are also worried of the precedent being set for expansion of use of ouster clauses. Clause 2 is not just a threat in this bill, but could come back to haunt us again and again if we do not act now to remove it. It is for this reason I oppose the government's Amendment 6. If Clause 2 is to stand, the protection given by subclause 4C is essential. This allows an appeal where the upper tribunal has acted in bad faith or in fundamental breach of the principles of natural justice. This already heavily caveated exception, why bad faith rather than bias, why fundamental rather than material breach, will be compounded if the exception on natural justice is qualified by the phrase procedural defect, and therefore I ask the government not to compound the offence here and to drop their amendment. Let me finally turn to Chapter 4 of Part 2 of the bill, dealing with coroners, and to our new clauses 4 to 6. I make no apology for retabling these clauses which were discussed in committee as they address a burning injustice, but let me first make a brief comment about what is in the bill. The Government explains their proposals as a series of reforms to the coroner's courts to improve their efficiency and help with the backlog. They mirror some of the provisions in other parts of Part 2 of the bill. We do not object to these in principle, but serious concerns have been raised with clauses 37-39. Clause 37 allows for the discontinuance of an investigation where the cause of death becomes clear before the beginning of an inquest, but the evidence for discontinuance may change once tested, and this could be significant, for example, where a death in the community appears initially to be from natural causes. Without the necessary safeguards, some deaths will not be properly scrutinised. Clause 38 gives coroners the power to hold inquests in writing where they decide a hearing is unnecessary. This takes away a family's right to request an in-person hearing. Clause 39 would enable remote attendance at inquest hearings. This has implications for the accessibility, transparency, participation and open justice. Taken together, clauses 37, 38 and 39 risk further entrenching levels of coronial inconsistency, which is a continuing problem in the coroner service, and they could exacerbate the difficulties faced by bereaved families who are not eligible for legal aid in navigating the inquest process. I hope we can return to these issues when the bill moves to the other place. What these clauses also do is draw attention to what is not in the bill. This bill does nothing to address the ongoing and deeply unjust inequality of arms in the coronial courts. It misses the opportunity to put bereaved people at the heart of the inquest system by providing non-means tested public funding for bereaved families at inquest where state bodies are represented. The current funding system for the bereaved at inquest is fundamentally unfair. State bodies have unlimited access to public funding for the best legal teams and experts, while families are often forced to pay large sums towards legal costs or represent themselves. Others have resorted to crowdfunding. This bill presents a timely opportunity to positively shape the inquest system for bereaved people by establishing in law the principle of equality of arms between families and public authorities and public authority interested persons. New Clause 4 would ensure that bereaved people, such as family members, are entitled to publicly funded legal representation at inquests where public bodies are legally represented. New Clause 5 and 6 would ensure that the early stages of legal help are available to the bereaved by removing the means test for legal aid applications and by bringing the definition of family in line with that in the Coroners and Justice Act. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'll bring my comments to a close, if I may now, just by saying this. We are well aware of the draft Hillsborough Bill at the moment and the 33-year battle for truth which those families have fought. At the original Hillsborough inquest, families received no public funding for representation, while state bodies were represented by 5 separate legal teams. And this led, as I say, to the draft Hillsborough law, which will provide for a statutory duty of candour for public bodies alongside publicly funded legal representation for bereaved families. This is the proposal whose time has not only come, but is long overdue. I know there is cross-party support here and in the other place, and if the Government is not yet ready to address this long-standing injustice, we will divide the House on New Clause 4 this afternoon. I'm grateful.
Publicly funded legal representation for bereaved people at inquests.
The question is that New Clause 4 be read a second time. In view of the shortness of time, I will have to impose, to start with, an 8-minute time limit, but it may very well have to be reduced as we go further on. Sir John Hayes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise to speak on New Clause 8 and 9, which stand in my name and the name of the Honourable Member for Ipswich. Those who served on the Bill Committee won't be unfamiliar with the arguments that I intend to address, as we rehearsed them at considerable length on that occasion, and the Minister knows well my concerns in general terms about this bill, that whilst it is a good start in dealing with the pressing issue of judicial review and how it has been distorted by recent judicial practice, it is only a start. We need much more wide-ranging reform of judicial review, and indeed much more wide-ranging reform of the relationship between this House and the judiciary, as set out in the Attorney-General's recent speech in Cambridge on judicial activism. The new Clause 8 addresses the issue of the Court's role in curtailing the use of the Regulatory and Investigatory Powers Act 2000, and more especially circumventing the role of the Investigatory Powers Tribunal. You will know, Madam Deputy Speaker, that I take a particular interest in this, having been Minister of the Home Office, introduced the later Investigatory Powers Act, dealing with the very issues of the necessary precautions and safeguards associated with the business of the storage and retrieval of electronic data. Indeed, in the bill that I took through the House, I introduced the double lock. That is to say that all warrants, as well as being dealt with by the Home Secretary, are in addition, as an additional safeguard, dealt with by the Judicial Commissioner. That safeguard was to ensure the core principles of proportionality and necessity which lay at the heart of all considerations of this kind. The problem is that the courts have taken upon itself to become involved in matters that should be the exclusive reserve of this House. And this is very important to see this bill in context. The supremacy of Parliament is fundamental to protecting the interests of the people. And Parliament's role in our constitutional settlement is not a matter, as was suggested during the evidence session by Aidan O'Neill QC, as a matter of neutrality.
Will the honourable member give way?
I will happily give way on that point.
Will the honourable member agree with me that the events of Brexit, expressed with such vivid importance, that the sovereignty of this place is always maintained and the will of the people is always respected?
Absolutely. And the separation of powers doesn't deal with neutrality. It deals with different powers which are, by constitutional arrangement, held by the courts and this place, and the relationship between the two is critical to our considerations today, and more critical still to our Constitution. A.V. Dicey argued that the separation of powers confers on Parliament a dominant characteristic. Parliament consists of Her Majesty the Queen, the House of Lords, the House of Commons acting together, and therefore, as Dicey said, the principle of parliamentary sovereignty means neither more or less than this. In Dicey's words, Parliament has the right to make or unmake any law whatever, and further, that no person or body is recognised by the law of England as having the right to override or set aside the legislation of Parliament. This is precisely the point that my honourable friend makes. We need to reaffirm that principle in general, and this bill is an opportunity to do so. Any Act of Parliament or any Parliament makes a new law or appeals or modifies law will be obeyed by the courts is fundamental to the role of this place and all of us, the people who represent, as my honourable said, represent the people and have a duty, not just a mission, a duty to reflect the will of the people. I happily give way to the honourable gentleman.
But isn't the point of judicial review to make sure that the government complies with the rules and restrictions that are set down by this Parliament? And restrictions on judicial review allow the government to ride roughshod over Parliament's views.
Yeah, that's of course true, and that's why judicial review exists. Of course, he's right that there need to be checks and balances, but the problem is that it is wrong to use judicial review to perpetuate matters of high politics, to perpetuate debates that have been settled in the country and in this place. And what we heard from the Minister when we debated these issues at considerable length was that what was in effect happening is people were having, in his words, several bites of the cherry. So the debates were had, had been settled, and then people would come back to reopen those debates, to revisit subjects that had already been agreed. That is not the role of the judicial process, and it's certainly not the role of judicial review, and the bill has some ways of addressing that. The purpose of the new clause is to probe and press the government to do more. And I strongly urge the Minister to accept these new clauses with enthusiasm and alacrity, because to involve the courts in matters of investigatory powers, as I said, is really quite wrong. And the Privacy International landmark case in May 2019 illustrates how wrong it can be. I won't go into details of that because time doesn't permit, but I know that other members will be familiar with that case and its legal ramifications, and I recommend the Attorney General's speech, which I mentioned already, to find out more. Richard Eakins QC, another person who gave evidence to the to the discussions on the bill and wrote an excellent paper on these subjects for policy exchange, describes the Supreme Court's judgment in respect of that case as a very serious attack on some fundamentals of the Constitution. So for a very long time, it was not accepted that the court should become involved in the matters, the investigative powers, and particularly the tribunal. There was no possibility of judicial review some 19 years after that Act was passed, the 2000 Act.
Honourable friend give one?
I will happily give one.
Yes, would my honourable friend confirm, my right honourable friend confirm, that these clauses would in effect have avoid judicial review departing from a narrow focus on a particular public act and becoming a free-ranging inquiry into government decision-making? Can he confirm that that would help in that?
My right honourable learned friend makes the point more eloquently than I ever could, partly due to her expertise. The real point is that these particular cases have created the possibility of a much more wide-ranging, as she suggests, rebalancing, reappraisal, without public consent, by the way, or indeed the public have not been consulted about it, of the relationship between courts and Parliament. And that's not good for the courts. We want to maintain the integrity of the judicial process by affirming the characteristic that they've long enjoyed, and which underpins the separation of powers. So on this particular, in this particular new clause, the government can do a great service not only to the cause that my honourable friend highlights, but also to improving this bill and in their own interest. The second new clause is new clause 9. It's important to understand this clause has two parts. Subsection 1 aims to limit the extent to which judicial review proceedings involve the testing of evidence and the resolution of disputing questions of fact. The traditional view is that judicial review proceedings are an inappropriate forum in which to solicit or test evidence because it is a supervisory jurisdiction which will focus on questions of law rather than questions of fact. But once again, what has occurred over time is the courts have strayed in to debates and inquiries about matters of fact rather than matters of law. The status quo that I described about fact and law prevailed for a very long time. But the role of the courts has altered, and furthermore, there's been a change in the application of judicial review in respect of evidence. The courts ought to be focusing on the legality of decisions, as the honourable gentleman said, and whether it stands up to appropriate levels of scrutiny. That's the business of a judicial review. Judicial review is supposed to be a backstop, a check of the kind the honourable gentleman described in his intervention. But, well, I will give way very briefly.
The difficulty I have with his argument is this. Where facts are in dispute, how can a court be expected to rule on a point of law without hearing evidence?
The court can take evidence, but what it shouldn't be doing is fishing for further information of a wider variety, which opens up consideration of the original process, rather than checking whether that process was right and proper. It is a subtle difference, but a fundamental one in terms of the change in the way courts have gone about their business. Our new clause addresses this issue, as the Minister will know. Jonathan Sumption is the judge who, perhaps more than any other, has set out the proper function of the courts in relation to Parliament. In his brief lecture, he said it's the proper function of the courts to stop government exceeding or abusing their legal powers. That is absolutely what judicial review should be, but I fear that it's being compromised by the changes that are taking place as a result of judicial activism. So, mindful of the Attorney General's advice on this, mindful of the fact that the government clearly are in tune with that advice, else they wouldn't have brought this bill in the first place, I urge them to accept the amendments to make this bill be as good as it can be. Rather than waiting for another bus to come along, we need to get on this one and get to the destination we all seek.
SNP spokesperson Anne McLaughlin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Much of this bill has no impact on Scotland, on our separate courts and legal system, so our amendments and my comments are focused on the parts that do, and that's primarily around judicial review. The parts of the bill I will address today aren't just bad, they're unnecessary, they're dangerous, and they lay the groundwork for the government to insulate itself and future governments from proper scrutiny and accountability. Something I'm sure is on their personal wish list given current events, but we ought to make policy for generations, for everyone, and not for one iteration of one political party. I sat for 11 sittings of the Bill Committee and waited for the government to persuade me that, for example, removing cart judicial review was necessary, but instead I heard odds and sods of anecdotal evidence, lots of legal jargon, and the phrase 3 bites of the cherry a total of 62 times, with the implication that somehow those using cart judicial review had greater access to justice, when it simply is not true. Cart judicial review is not saying, I don't like the decision you've come to, let's try again for a different judgment. It's looking at the situation where, first of all, a serious error of law may have been committed in the first-tier tribunal, and then the upper tribunal has failed to recognise and correct this error. It could be that the first-tier tribunal has failed to consider or misinterpreted the evidence, or that the facts are inconsistent with the decision. The point is, it happens. Mistakes are made, and cart judicial reviews provide a vital safeguard to correct those errors in cases where the stakes can be incredibly high. So rather than a third bite of the cherry, the reality is that the first bite wasn't even a slither. A mistake was made. And mistakes don't just affect the person in question, the ramifications are wider than that. Just as cart judicial reviews don't only give one person who's appealed the opportunity to have their case considered properly, but they also catch out errors and injustices that benefit the system as a whole. Cart judicial reviews have been used to ensure that disabled people are given the right benefit entitlement. They've stopped people being made homeless. They've prevented the deportation of people to countries where they faced certain death. I'm currently waiting to attend a first-tier tribunal on behalf of a family member, and with my knowledge of her and of the social security system, I am 100% certain of her entitlement, and equally certain it will only fail if a mistake is made when considering the evidence. If that happens, surely my family member deserves the right to have it rectified. Surely everybody does. The thing is, the government knows that the impact will be far greater on those who are the most vulnerable. In their own impact statement for this bill, they admit, their words, that abolishing cart would mean that those who lose out are more likely to have particular protected characteristics, for example, in respect of race and/or religion or belief. So anyone voting for this ought to be aware and be honest with their constituents that they are consciously voting to the detriment of their constituents with protected characteristics. And this will only save an estimated £364,000 to £402,000 per year. That's it. That's the cost of protecting the rights of some of the most vulnerable people. Not much to ask for, is it? But let's not pretend that it's about being prudent with the public purse after writing off £4.3 billion of fraudulent COVID claims last year. We will vote against this terrible bill, but if it does go ahead, our amendments 42 and 43 are about protecting the Scottish courts and tribunals from this clause. We in Scotland do not want it. The legal profession does not want it. The Scottish Government does not want it. And I guarantee the people of Scotland do not want it. This Government is trying very hard to demonstrate their alleged respect for Scotland in words, if not actions, as the Scottish Government lays the groundwork for an independence referendum. Some would say it's because of that independence referendum. Well, now is their chance. Now is the chance for every party in this place to show Scotland just how much respect they have for our separate and distinct legal system and our right to protect it and ourselves from this legislation. My final thoughts on Clause 2 are on the way in which the Government intends to make this happen, the legal framework. The Government says that the use of an ouster clause will set a precedent for removing certain areas or cases out of the scope of judicial review. Well, what does that mean? That means that in future they intend to cherry-pick areas they would rather not see judicially reviewed, which sounds every bit as dangerous as it is. The rule of law and the separation of powers are hallmarks of an effective democracy. We cannot allow the Government to care and how they face judicial scrutiny. As Liberty reminds us in their briefing, this bill is passing through Parliament at the same time as the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, the Nationality and Borders Bill and the Election Bill, to name a few. Now more than ever do we need the ability and deserve the right to hold the Government and public bodies to account. Clause 1 on suspended quashing orders and prospective-only remedies does not extend to Scottish courts and will not apply directly, but it will affect UK-wide legislation, which we are all subject to. It will also mean that many more people from across these islands may choose Scottish courts, and whilst I'm always happy to promote Scotland and our separate legal system, there may be a capacity issue that has not been discussed or even considered. Now, myself and others have raised the landmark Unison Judicial Review 2017 a number of times. Just very briefly, the Supreme Court agreed in 2017 that the fees to access justice via employment tribunals were unlawful, so everyone who'd paid them was refunded. The government was no longer allowed to charge them from the moment of that judgment. Let's consider what would happen if this legislation passes, and instead of bringing that judicial review in 2017, Unison brought it this year and, crucially, got the same decision. The decision that the workers were right and what the government was doing was unlawful. The difference if this bill is enacted is that nobody bringing the judicial review would have their fees refunded. Nobody else who'd already been forced to pay up to £1,200 for an employment tribunal would be refunded either, despite the court agreeing that they'd been subject to something unlawful. Anyone subsequently requiring an employment tribunal would still have to pay the unlawful fees, and meantime, the government would be able to tweak the legislation and make the unlawful lawful. Who would or could go to the expense and trouble of seeking a judicial review given the prospect of no remedy, no justice and no change in theirs or anyone else's situation? The delaying of a quashing order, so I'm trying to race through this, Madam Deputy Speaker. The delaying of a quashing order is in certain circumstances the appropriate path to follow, but that's why the courts already have this option. The issue is that it's currently an option, and this seeks to make it a presumption. The independent review of administrative law, which has been largely ignored with regards to its recommendations for judicial review, suggested that giving the courts the option was enough. But here we see the government determined to fetter judicial discretion and tie the hands of judges. Our amendment is to change it back from saying judges must to judges may use this. And if we continue to argue that they are not trying to tie the hands of the judges, then surely the government will support it tonight.
I call Helen Morgan to make her maiden speech.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm humbled today to be standing in this historic chamber representing the people of North Shropshire. Those of you who have visited will know that it is a large and beautiful landscape, populated with pretty market towns and villages, and with a long and fascinating history. I would like to start by thanking my predecessor, Owen Paterson, for almost a quarter of a century of service to the people of North Shropshire, and in particular for his recent campaign and charitable work for suicide prevention. It's impossible to visit North Shropshire without being taken back in time. An Iron Age fort at Oswestry starts the story, as the first settlers here pioneered the farming industry that underpins the local economy to this day. In Welsh, the site is known as Caer Ogefan, meaning City of Gogefan, the father of Guinevere in Arthurian legend, and the intertwined story of North Shropshire and British politics may have begun there. The next step in our history is at Whitchurch, an important staging post on the Roman road to Chester. It takes its modern name from St Alkmund's Church, originally built with white sandstone quarried in the south of the constituency at Grinshill. And here the association continues. This fine white sandstone was also used to make the lintels and door surround of number 10 Downing Street. And I'm sure the Prime Minister will be reminded of the beautiful constituency of North Shropshire each time he passes through that In the medieval period, Ellesmere's great castle was taken by Llewellyn the Great, not to be reclaimed by the English until after his death. Its remains are now largely confined to the earthworks they were built on. But luckily, the fortifications at Whittington and Morton Corbett still bear testament to the turbulence of life in the marches of the medieval kingdom. Internal strife has played its part as well. In the early stages of the Wars of the Roses, the Yorkist army thundered past Market Drayton and through North Shropshire, eager to link up with reinforcements in Ludlow after its victory at nearby Blore Heath. In the Civil War, the residents of Wem, the town closest to my home, proved that the communities of North Shropshire are not just decent and resilient, but occasionally radical. It was the first town in Shropshire to declare for the parliamentarians in the Civil War. The troops garrisoned in the town had not completed their wooden defences and had only 40 musketeers to hold their position in 1643 when the Royalist army approached. The Royalists, complacent and confident in victory, approached from Saltern to the east. But the legend has it that the women of Wem rallied to the parliamentarian cause and the garrison held. So it seems that while I am the first woman to represent this area in Parliament, I'm continuing a fine tradition of women in North Shropshire defending our democracy. I am reminded of the brave women of Wem when I consider the impact of this bill. I am sure that colleagues on both sides of this House would agree that our democracy, which has evolved over hundreds of years and since the 17th century largely peacefully, should be protected at all costs. Fundamental to that democracy is that the rule of law is upheld without fear or favour. But this bill seeks to undermine that principle. It will limit the ability of ordinary people to hold this government to account through the courts. Judicial review is working well. It is a powerful tool for individuals to enforce their rights and stop governments from overstepping their powers. That's it. Abolishing carte judicial review, for example, would remove a safeguard when tribunals make mistakes in cases where the stakes are often extremely high for the people involved. It is completely unjustified and a backward step.
Absolutely right.
That is why my Liberal Democrat colleagues and I are supporting Amendment number 5 in the name of my honourable friend, the member for Bath. Threatening to weaken the people's ability to challenge the government because the courts sometimes rule against you is the act of dictators and despots, not Democrats. The best way for a government to avoid that situation is to ensure it acts lawfully in the first place, not legislate to ensure that there is one rule for the citizens of this country and another for its leaders. The circumstances of my election suggest that the majority of voters in North Shropshire would agree. As their representative on these green benches and in the home of democracy, I will always defend their democratic rights and listen to their concerns, regardless of the candidate for whom their vote was cast. I will not give up on the fight for the issues that matter most to them: better access to health and ambulance services, a fair deal for our farming community, and proper provision of infrastructure and public services in rural areas. I very much look forward to working with my colleagues on both sides of this House to achieve that. Thank you.
Well, I congratulate the Honourable Lady on her maiden speech. She's clearly going to be a very lively contributor to our debates. In order to ensure that we fit everybody in, I'm going to have to reduce the time limit to 6 minutes, and I call Paula Barker.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I would also like to congratulate the member for North Shropshire on her wonderful maiden speech and welcome her to her seat in this place. The honourable member talked about this historic chamber, but of course she herself has made history by being the first Lib Dem to hold the seat and of course to be the first the first female MP in that seat. I wish you all the very best in your endeavours to represent your constituents. Madam Deputy Speaker, opposition members have studied this bill closely. There is currently many bills on the legislative agenda from the government that are much cause for concern. Certainly, this bill, the Judicial Review and Courts Bill, may not be one occupying a high profile as others, but nevertheless, there is much in it that I and opposition members want to see significantly amended. I fear this government's mantra of obsessing over costs and superficially driving for efficiencies will negatively impact the judicial process, and of course this may be politically expedient for the executive, who have demonstrated time and time again their desire to avoid accountability. We cannot do justice on the cheap. The consequences for ordinary people for the processes that deliver just outcomes will be grave. I want to place on record my support for two significant amendments. First, my own front bench is right in supporting Amendment 23, which would remove Clause 1 out of the bill entirely. Quashing orders are a powerful tool which ensures that unlawful government decisions can be overturned and those who have suffered the consequences of unlawfulness can obtain real redress. There are already limitations on a court's ability to grant a quashing order, but I suspect the government already know that. Madam Deputy Speaker, to tip the scales even further in favour of the executive is wholly wrong. I also want to voice support for Amendment 5, laid down by our Liberal Democrat colleagues, that would remove Clause 2 of the bill. It is essential we preserve the ability of claimants to seek judicial review of a decision made by the upper tribunal. The Supreme Court recognised that some overall judicial supervision of the decisions of the upper tribunal safeguard against the risk that errors of law and real significance slip through the system. Doing away with coarse judicial review runs the risk of us getting things wrong on matters of life and death. No matter how infrequently decisions are overturned, a safety net, rarely used, is still a safety net. In the words of Lord John Dyson, in asylum cases, fundamental human rights are in play, often including the right to life and the right not to be subjected to torture. Organisations like Public Law Project are clear. Coarse judicial review represents excellent value for money, despite the government's shallow arguments around cost. And according to the Public Law Project, the total cost saved by abolishing the court jurisdiction is estimated at $364,000 to $402,000 per year. Usefully, as they too have provided context, this amount represents less than the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport spent on its art collection in the period 2019 to 2020, Madam Deputy Speaker. Part 1 of this bill represents a very real degradation of the rights and of the citizens and organisations to hold the executive to account. The last thing our state needs, not least during this time, are less safeguards in place, especially in the areas of justice, with the likes of the Home Office currently pursuing a nonsensical approach to asylum that plays only to the court of political opinion and not the fundamentals of human rights. There are several new clauses laid down that have my wholehearted support, in particular new Clause 2 and new Clause 4. And Madam Deputy Speaker, I know that the next debate we will be speaking about new Clause 2. It goes without saying, as a Liverpool MP, I enthusiastically support new Clause 4. Going up against the establishment can be extremely daunting for ordinary working people, even when the gravest of wrongs have been committed, sometimes by institutions that are funded by and should be accountable to the public. And when looking at legislative matters related to justice, we must always make justice accessible, so justice can be done and done so in a timely manner. Public institutions cannot rely on their vastly greater resources to deny justice and closure to those who simply seek a level playing field. New Clause 4 would do that. In rounding up, Madam Deputy Speaker, there's a lot of bad in this bill as it stands, and a lot that's not yet in it. The government should not be partisan when it comes to justice. Right and wrong supersedes political alliances, and for this, they should take seriously many of the amendments set out before us today. Thank you.